The first stars appeared before anyone knew how to name them. They didn't ask permission, they didn't negotiate, they simply burned, and the darkness had no choice but to make room. Tonight, inside the celestial palace of Arkenspire, a wedding is about to begin. A king who has bled 12 years across every border of the known world is finally signing his last treaty. He believes the bride behind that veil is nothing more than a political signature. He's wrong. Before this night ends, the stars will have a new name, and the world will never recover. Drop your city below, and don't you dare look away. The wedding candles had been burning for 3 hours by the time Vaelor Draven decided he hated the smell of wax. It was a petty thought for a king to carry into his own wedding ceremony, but Vaelor had long since abandoned the idea that kings were required to think noble thoughts at every moment. He stood at the altar of Arkenspire's grand celestial hall, a chamber so vast its ceiling had been engineered to replicate the night sky, brass mechanisms turning in slow rotation to move painted constellations across a dome the size of a small city. And he focused on the smell of burning wax, because focusing on the smell of burning wax meant he did not have to focus on the woman walking toward him down the aisle. He didn't know her name. That fact had started bothering him somewhere around the second hour, not because he cared particularly. Political marriages were contracts, and contracts did not require the parties involved to exchange pleasantries beyond what the lawyers demanded. He had been briefed on the southern province of Elindra, on its grain yields and its silver deposits, and its strategic position along the coastal trade routes. He had been briefed on the noblewoman's lineage, daughters of a minor lord, unremarkable bloodline, no political ambitions of her own. He had not been briefed on her name because her name had not been relevant. The thing that bothered him was not ignorance. The thing that bothered him was that, standing here in front of 300 lords and generals and merchant princes who had come to witness Vareth's northern king finally make an alliance that might end the border wars. Standing here in his war-scarred armor, which he had refused to remove because he was a soldier and would be buried as one, he felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely unprepared. Vaelor Draven had not felt unprepared since he was 19. The woman reached the edge of the aisle. Her veil was white silk, and it caught the candlelight and the slow mechanical starlight from the brass constellations above. And for one disorienting moment, she looked like something that had fallen from the ceiling rather than walked through the doors. He made himself stop looking at her. He made himself look at the officiator, an old court functionary with ink-stained fingers, and a voice like crumbling stone, who was already clearing his throat and reaching for the ceremonial blade. This was what survival looked like sometimes. Not battlefields, not sieges, not the cold mathematics of troop positions at 4 a.m. when you had 600 soldiers and the enemy had 3,000 and you had to find the angle. There was always an angle that turned the numbers into something survivable. Sometimes survival looked like standing still and letting the world do what it was going to do, because fighting it would cost more than you had left to spend. Vaelor had spent 12 years learning that particular form of discipline. His body had learned it first. The ability to remain completely motionless even when every instinct was screaming at him to move, to strike, to run. His wolf essence understood stillness as a hunting strategy long before his human mind understood it as a political one. But he had learned. He had learned that the hardest battles were not fought with steel. He had learned that the hardest battles were the ones where you stood in a room full of people who needed something from you, and you gave it to them and you did not let them see what it cost. "My Lord King," the officiator's voice, the ceremony beginning. Vaelor stepped forward. "You're nervous." The voice came from the woman beside him, low enough that only he could hear it beneath the officiator's formal recitation of the treaty terms. It was not an accusation. It was not a taunt. It was delivered with a precision that suggested the speaker was more comfortable stating observed facts than performing social niceties, which was either a useful quality or an exhausting one. And Vaelor had not yet decided which. He did not look at her. "I'm not. Your jaw has been tight for 40 minutes. Your shoulders are positioned the way soldiers position their shoulders when they're expecting an attack from the right flank." A pause. He processed that. "You know military posture. I know most things that are useful to know. Being useful is how I survived being useless." That was a strange thing to say at your own wedding. Vaelor finally looked at her. She was looking straight ahead, at the officiator, her profile sharp and still beneath the veil. She was not what he had expected, though he would have struggled to articulate what he had expected. Something softer, perhaps. Something that matched the word noblewoman the way noblewoman was supposed to be matched. Carefully constructed fragility. The kind of practiced delicateness that told you immediately that you were looking at someone who had never been cold or hungry or afraid. This woman's hands, resting at her sides, were the hands of someone who had spent time gripping things. There were calluses along her right palm that he recognized because he had them too, in the same place, from years of practice blade use. "What's your name?" he said. It came out less like a question and more like something he was correcting about himself. She turned her head slightly. He could feel her looking at him through the veil. "Serafina Veilhart. I should have known that before today." "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." There was no bitterness in it. That was the thing that caught him off guard, that she could say that with such flat accuracy, such absence of performance. She was not punishing him. She was simply noting a fact about how she had been handled, the way you might note a logistical error in a supply chain, dispassionately, because anger about it would not change the error and would only cost you energy you needed elsewhere. Veilor understood that economy of feeling. He had practiced it for most of his adult life. He found, to his considerable surprise, that it made him want to know more about her. Not much more. Not anything that would complicate the contract. Just more. "Did they tell you anything about me?" he asked, "before they sent you north?" "They told me you had won 17 major engagements in 12 years, that your casualty rates were lower than any other commanding general in Vareth's history, which indicates either exceptional tactical ability or an unusual willingness to retreat when retreat was the correct answer." A breath. "They told me you hadn't smiled publicly in 4 years. I thought that was probably a political observation, but now that I'm standing next to you, I think it was a medical one." Something happened in his chest that might have been the beginning of something dangerous. He shut it down before it could properly form. "You're observant." "I've had nothing else to be." She paused. "They told me you have a wolf. I was curious about that. I've never—" And here, just barely, the precise voice cracked a fraction along one edge. "I've never met anyone like what you are." "What I am," he repeated, tasting the words. "Something that has survived being itself. I find that—" She stopped. The officiator's voice rose slightly, drawing attention back to the formal recitation. Serafina faced forward again. In a voice barely above breath, "I find that I have not, historically, survived that particularly well." Veilor thought about that for the rest of the ceremony. The blood rite was the part that most southern nobles found archaic. It was a northern tradition, ancient before Vareth itself was ancient, pre-empire, pre-border, pre-everything, except the wolf packs and the winter and the understanding that some bonds required more than words to hold. When Veilor had insisted on including it in the ceremony structure, his council had raised objections, soft objections, the kind of objections that didn't quite meet your eyes. He had overruled them because there was a part of him, the part that had spent 12 years in the field, the part that had made deals in the mud and sealed them with handshakes and blood and the weight of mutual survival, that could not stomach the idea of binding himself to someone with nothing more substantial than ink on a treaty document. He needed something real, something that cost both parties, something that could not be easily undone. The officiator produced the ceremonial blade, plain steel, old, the handle worn smooth from generations of use. Veilor took it first, pressed the edge against his left palm, watched blood well up in a clean line, felt nothing. Pain had been ordinary for so long that it had become simply texture. He passed the blade to Serafina. She took it without hesitation, pressed it against her own palm with a steadiness that surprised him. Drew blood, did not flinch. Their hands came together, palm to palm. The officiator spoke the binding words in Old Northern, a language that most of the southern guests would not understand. And somewhere in the high reaches of the mechanical constellation ceiling, gears turned and the stars shifted position. And then something happened that was not part of the ceremony. The moment their blood mingled, Serafina went absolutely rigid. Not the polite stiffness of ceremony, not nerves. She became rigid the way a building becomes rigid when something strikes its foundation. A total, instantaneous stillness that was the opposite of collapse, the opposite of yielding, a stillness that was actually the desperate application of maximum internal force against something trying to move through her. Baelor felt it too. Not pain, the opposite of pain. Something enormous pressing outward from the point of contact. Not heat exactly, not electricity exactly, not anything that mapped onto his existing vocabulary for physical sensation. His wolf essence, which had been contained and quiet in the way it was always quiet in public situations because he had learned to keep it leashed around crowds, lurched toward her like a dog toward a scent it had been waiting its whole life to find. He grabbed her wrist with his free hand. "What's happening?" "I don't—" Her voice had changed. The precision was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched across something enormous trying to push through it. "I don't know. I was told there might be— my father said there were things in the bloodline, but he never told me what they were, only that I had to stay hidden, only that—" A sound. Not from the guests, not from the officiator, from above. Every single painted constellation on the ceiling dome lit up simultaneously. Not the warm amber of candlelight reflection. White. Cold. The light of actual stars. Brass gears that had been moving in slow ceremonial rotation began spinning. Fast. Too fast. The mechanism groaned under the speed increase, and Seraphina's veil, with no wind present in the sealed chamber, lifted. Fell. The hall went silent. Her eyes. Baelor had heard soldiers describe the moment before a major battle as the moment where reality thinned, where ordinary objects stopped looking fully solid, where the distance between what was happening and what you understood to be possible became briefly, terrifyingly narrow. He had always understood that description as metaphor. He revised that understanding now. Seraphina Valhart's eyes contained stars. Not the reflection of stars. Not an unusual color that resembled starlight. Stars. Living constellations, moving slowly within the dark field of her irises. The same constellations that were blazing to life on the ceiling above them, responding to each other, mirror and original. And she was looking at him with those eyes, and she looked terrified, and he realized suddenly that he was still gripping her wrist. He did not let go. This was the moment when he should have let go. This was the moment when any tactically intelligent man would have released her wrist, stepped back, begun assessing the situation from a distance that gave him options. Baelor Draven tightened his grip instead. "Breathe," he said. "I am breathing. You're not. Breathe." She breathed. Ragged, uneven, the breath of someone whose body had forgotten the automatic for a moment. Her free hand came up and gripped his forearm, hard. He felt the calluses on her palm, the ones that matched his. The light in the ceiling pulsed. Then, from 3 separate entrances to the hall, the main doors behind the guest rows, the 2 side corridors that fed into the ceremonial space from the palace's eastern and western wings, armed figures appeared, not palace guards. Palace guards wore Vareth's colors, steel gray and deep blue, and their armor was functional, built for the kind of close-quarters work that palace security actually required. These figures wore black. All black. No house markings, no identifying insignia of any kind. They wore the anonymity of people who understood that the greatest gift you could give your employer was the inability of anyone who saw you to say with certainty who had sent you. There were at least 30 of them, probably more in the corridors. The first one through the main doors had a voice trained for carrying across loud spaces. He used it now, pitched to reach every corner of the hall, every guest, every servant, every guard. "Kill the Star Sovereign before the awakening begins." The hall erupted. Well, the first thing Baelor did was get Seraphina behind him. Not because she required protection. He had no data yet on what she was capable of. And the light blazing from her eyes suggested that protection might be the wrong frame entirely. He got her behind him because it was the tactically correct position for maintaining situational control while assessing a threat environment, and because the wolf in him, which had stopped being quiet approximately 90 seconds ago, understood at a level below words that whatever had just happened when their blood touched was significant, and significant things required proximity, and proximity required positioning. The second thing he did was take the ceremonial blade he was still holding, plain steel, old, worn handle, and drive it into the throat of the first assassin who reached the altar. Not because it was the most efficient option, because he did not have a better weapon immediately available. and because making the first exchange fast and final was important for the psychological geometry of a room. 29 people were about to make decisions about how to behave. Those decisions would be partly based on what they observed happening to the first person who closed distance on him. He wanted the observation to be discouraging. The man dropped. The next two pulled back, reassessing. "Behind the altar," Valor said to Serafina, without looking away from the room. "There are the guests. The guests are already getting out. Look left." There were exits she hadn't been in this hall long enough to map. His generals, positioned throughout the crowd as a standard precaution he always insisted on, were already moving guests through side passages. 3 of his field commanders were drawing weapons. "Look at me." She looked at him. The stars in her eyes were brighter now, moving faster. There was something happening around her. Not visible exactly, more like a pressure in the air, the way the air changed before a storm when the electrical charge built past a certain threshold. "Whatever is building inside you," he said, "whatever that is. Can you hold it?" Her jaw worked. "I don't know what it is. I have never done this before." "Can you hold it for approximately 4 minutes?" I think I need a yes or I need a no. Choose one." The stars in her eyes steadied, very slightly. Something in her face shifted, not calm exactly, but the kind of focus that lived just below the surface of panic when someone with the right internal architecture found a task to grip. "Yes." "Good. Get behind the altar. Don't come out until I tell you. You have 30 assassins and a ceremonial knife." "I have 30 assassins and a ceremonial knife and 3 field commanders and 5 years of working in worse odds than this." "Get behind the altar." She went. The thing about 30 assassins, the thing that his opponents had historically failed to account for, was that 30 assassins in an enclosed space was not 30 threats. It was a crowd problem. Crowds had fluid dynamics. They had choke points, pressure gradients, panic cascades. 30 people trying to move toward a single target in a single room tended to get in each other's way. Vialor moved first, which was the only thing that mattered. He cut left, not toward the main group but toward the nearest column. Not for cover, columns were useless for cover against ranged weapons, but for the angle it created, forcing the nearest cluster of black-armored figures to adjust their approach while his 3 commanders hit the assassins from 2 side points. He was calculating as he moved. The way he had been calculating since he was 19 years old, the way his mind had been shaped by a decade of situations where the numbers were wrong, and the only currency that bought survival was speed of assessment. What he knew: professional assassination teams in enclosed spaces prioritized the primary target. He was currently presenting as the primary threat, which was taking priority designation off Serafina, which was the point. What he suspected, the assassins had a secondary protocol. You didn't say Star Sovereign with that kind of weight in your voice if you didn't have a specific understanding of what you were dealing with. Someone had briefed them. Someone had done a great deal of work to get 30 armed professionals into a royal ceremony in the most heavily secured palace in the Northern Empire. That level of preparation suggested multiple contingencies. It suggested resources. It suggested this was not in any sense over tonight. He took a cut across the left shoulder from a blade he didn't move fast enough to avoid and filed the pain away in the part of his mind built for that, the long corridor he had constructed over years of field work, where all the things that were happening to his body but could not be dealt with right now were stored, intact, waiting for the moment when he could afford to address them. 3 minutes in. His commanders had cut the number down to maybe 20, maybe a few less. The light in the ceiling was doing something that he was choosing not to look at directly because looking at it would take his attention off the room, and his attention off the room would get him killed. The pressure in the air was building. He heard Serafina make a sound from behind the altar. Not a cry. Something lower. Something that sounded like someone trying very hard not to do something their body was demanding. "Hold," he said, without turning his head. "I'm trying. Hold." 4 minutes. He put the ceremonial blade through the last organized cluster, or rather through the formation integrity of the last organized cluster. A commander's job was not to fight every soldier. A commander's job was to break the coherence of the opposing force until individual soldiers began making individual decisions, and individual soldiers making individual decisions, in an unfavorable situation, almost always decided to leave, and the remaining assassins, which he counted at 11, pulled back toward the side corridors. They left their dead. Professionals. They would regroup, report, adapt. He had maybe 10 minutes before whatever they had waiting in the palace exterior came in with better numbers and a refined approach. Valor turned around. The altar was stone, old, carved with the kind of elaborate knotwork that northern craftsmen spent lifetimes perfecting. Serafina was pressed against the back of it, seated on the floor, her knees pulled up, both hands pressed flat against the stone beside her. The white wedding gown had a long tear along the hem where she had moved quickly, and the blood from her ceremonial cut had dried dark on her palm. Her eyes were blazing, not blazing like a figure of speech. The stars in them were producing actual light now, subtle, cold, white. Not enough to read by, but enough to be visible in the dimness behind the altar, enough to create small shadows that moved as her eyes moved. The constellations on the ceiling dome were going dark one by one, the brass mechanisms grinding to a halt as something drained the energy that had been powering them. The same something, he suspected, was building inside her. "You held it," he said. She looked up at him. Her breathing was ragged. Her hands were shaking against the stone. "I held the obvious part. There's something else, something that started when our blood—" She stopped. Her jaw was tight. "It doesn't feel like it's going to ask permission." He crouched down to her level, got a clear look at her face, at the precise, controlled features that had been precise and controlled throughout the entire ceremony and were now doing their best to remain that way under conditions that no amount of preparation could have adequately addressed. His shoulder was bleeding through the armor joint. He ignored it. "The people who just tried to kill you," he said. "The Order of the Void Crown. You know that name." It was not a question. He had watched her face when the assassin called it out. Something had moved in her expression then, quickly contained. "I know it," she said. "Tell me. My father—" Her voice caught, started again. "My father spent my entire life making sure I was invisible. Crystal Towers, Valor. Do you know what that means? I lived in Crystal Towers because the light passes through and doesn't cast shadows that anyone could track. I had no servants with names I could remember afterward. I had lessons in things that were useful in a tower. Languages, mathematics, military history from texts that were old enough that no one living could use the information to find me. And I had nothing else. And when I was old enough to ask why, he told me there were people who had been waiting across generations for someone like me to be born again. And if they found me before the power could—" She pressed her forehead against her knees briefly. When she lifted it, the light in her eyes had intensified. "He never told me what would happen when the power came. He only told me that whatever I felt building inside me, I had to keep it inside. That I could not let it out. That if I let it out before I understood it, what happens if you let it out?" The chamber trembled, not violently. A deep, slow vibration, like a sound below the range of hearing, making itself known through stone and bone instead. 3 of the remaining ceiling constellations went to full light simultaneously. Through the tall arched windows along the eastern wall, Valor could see stars. It was afternoon. Stars were not visible in the afternoon. "I don't know," Serafina said. "I've never let it out." Outside, beyond the walls of Arkenspire, from the direction of the palace's outer courtyard, screaming began. He stood, assessed the distance between the screaming and their position. 3 minutes, assuming the outer gates had held, possibly less. He looked down at her. She was looking up at him. The light in her eyes was the coldest, most extraordinary thing he had ever seen, and he had seen empires on fire. "Can you walk?" he said. "Yes." "Can you walk fast?" Something in her face sharpened into a familiar shape, the shape of someone who had spent years being asked less of than they could deliver. "Yes." He reached down. She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet, and the moment they touched, that pressure in the air spiked so sharply it made his ears ring, and the last constellation on the dome went to blazing white. And somewhere deep in his chest, his wolf said something that had no words but had a very clear meaning. He did not have time to examine that meaning. "There's a passage," he said, "behind the north sacristy wall. It comes out at the stables." "How far are the stables from the outer gates?" 40 seconds at a run. And beyond the outer gates. Open country, hills. I have a camp 3 miles north that my council doesn't know about, because I have been doing this long enough to know that the camp your council knows about is the camp your enemies know about. He checked the corridors, clear for the moment. We move now. She gathered the torn wedding gown in one fist, unselfconsciously, the way someone gathered fabric when fabric was an inconvenience and inconveniences were dealt with. No ceremony about it, no performance of delicacy. He moved. She matched him. They were through the sacristy passage and into the stone corridor beyond when the sound hit them. Not screaming this time, something deeper, something structural. The sound of the palace's eastern wing doing something that palace wings were not architecturally intended to do. Valor stopped. Seraphina stopped beside him. Through the narrow passage window, no wider than his forearm, they could see the courtyard. The sky above Arkenspire was not the afternoon sky anymore. It was not any sky he had a category for. The stars that had been appearing in daylight had multiplied, had spread, had filled the blue with white in a pattern that matched, exactly matched, the constellations on Seraphina's veil, the constellations that had blazed to life on the dome ceiling, the constellations in her eyes. The Order of the Void Crown forces in the courtyard had stopped moving. Every one of them was looking up. Every one of them was afraid. And in the center of the courtyard, standing absolutely still, was a woman in black armor who had not been there a moment ago. She was not looking at the sky. She was looking directly at the passage window, directly at them. Her face was unreadable at this distance, but the thing she held in her right hand was visible enough, a device of dark metal and crystal. And it was pulsing with a light that was the exact color of a dying star. "That's an anchor," Seraphina said. Her voice had gone completely flat. "What is it?" "It's designed to pull the power out before it can stabilize, force the awakening before the host is ready." A pause that was not hesitation was instead the brief interval required to process something devastating and decide immediately how to respond to it. "If she uses that on me, I will not survive it." The woman in the courtyard raised the anchor, aimed it, and in that instant, every window in the eastern wing of Arkenspire shattered outward simultaneously, and the stars above rewrote themselves into a pattern that had not appeared in any sky in recorded history, and Seraphina Veilheart's hand, still clasped in Vialor Draven's, burned cold as the deep dark between galaxies, and he felt the thing his wolf had been trying to tell him finally arrive in his understanding, full and irreversible. She was not the last card in a treaty. She was the reason the treaty had been arranged, and someone, somewhere, had been planning this night for a very long time. The anchor fired. The anchor fired. The beam that came out of it was not light. Not exactly. Light traveled in straight lines and obeyed the geometry of the world it moved through. What came from the dark metal device in the woman's hand moved like something that had forgotten the rules. It bent. It reached. It corrected its own trajectory, the way a thrown blade corrected for wind. It was looking for something, looking for the specific signature of what lived inside Seraphina Veilheart, and it had been calibrated with enough precision to find it through walls. Valor pulled her sideways, not because he had calculated the beam's trajectory in the half-second available to him. He hadn't. He pulled her sideways because his wolf had been screaming the direction at him for a full 2 seconds before his conscious mind caught up. And he had learned, over years of surviving situations where conscious thought was too slow, to trust the screaming. The beam passed through the passage window where Seraphina's head had been and hit the stone wall beyond. The stone did not shatter. It went dark. Not scorched dark, not damaged dark. Empty dark. A section of the wall approximately the size of a human chest simply lost whatever property had made it stone and became something else. Something without structure, without solidity, without the fundamental coherence that held matter together. Then it crumbled. Seraphina was on her hands and knees on the passage floor, breathing hard. Valor had one hand on her shoulder and one eye on the window. In the courtyard, the woman in black armor was adjusting the anchor's angle for a second attempt. "Get up," he said. Now." She got up. He didn't give her time to assess her own condition or decide how she felt about the floor of a stone passage or anything else that was not forward motion. He moved. She moved with him. This was something he had noticed about her in the 4 minutes they had spent fighting in the Great Hall. She did not require momentum to be built. She did not need time to shift from stillness to action. When action was required, she was already in it. Whatever her father's crystal towers had taken from her, they had not taken that. They hit the sacristy door at speed. He broke through it. Old hinges, the kind of old that meant centuries rather than decades. And centuries of hinges had their limits. And they were in the narrow passage beyond, moving north toward the stable access. And behind them the courtyard sounds were changing. The screaming had stopped. What replaced it was silence, and silence was always worse. "She'll adjust," Serafina said, keeping pace. Her voice was functioning, which meant her body was functioning, which was more than he had guaranteed 30 seconds ago. "The anchor recalibrates between uses. We have maybe 2 minutes before she can fire again." "How do you know that?" "Because my father described them." A beat. He was thorough about the things that could kill me. They rounded a corner, took a half-flight of stone steps, and emerged into the covered walkway that ran along the palace's northern interior wall. The stables were 40 feet ahead. He could hear horses, not calm, not the patience of horses used to crowds and noise, but the tight, stamping restlessness of animals that knew something was wrong and were waiting for the information to cohere into a decision. "The woman with the anchor," he said. "You know who she is." Serafina's jaw was set. "I have a very strong suspicion." "Tell me the suspicion." "After we are not in an enclosed stone corridor that has one exit." "Fair." He pushed through the stable door. Bishtin. He took 2 horses. His own gray, which he had ridden for 6 years and which did not panic under the smell of blood, and which had earned, through the accumulated evidence of 6 years, his trust, and a black that Serafina chose herself, moving quickly through the stalls with the decisiveness of someone who had spent time around horses, even if the circumstances of that time were unclear. Crystal towers. How did you learn horses in a crystal tower? He stored the question. They were out through the stable's northern gate in under 3 minutes, and he kept the pace hard across the outer courtyard, through the postern gate that his key opened. He always carried the key, a habit from the first year of the border wars when 3 separate occasions had taught him that exits were worth more than entrances, and into the open ground beyond the palace walls. The sky above them was wrong. He had processed this in the courtyard and set it aside because processing it fully would have cost him attention he needed elsewhere. He allowed himself to process it now, in the first 30 seconds of open ground, while they moved toward the tree line at the hill's base. The stars were still there. Afternoon sky, blue, clear, and full of stars that belonged to nighttime. The constellation pattern they had arranged themselves into was the same pattern that had been blazing on Serafina's ceiling dome. The same pattern, he now understood, that was tattooed somewhere in the ancient architecture of her bloodline. The land beneath the wrong sky felt aware. That was the only way he had for it. The grass moved differently. The shadows fell at angles that did not correspond to the sun's position, as if reality was paying attention to something and had briefly forgotten to maintain its own consistency. "The sky," he said. "I know." "Is that you?" A pause. Honest. The kind of pause that was not evasion, but genuine uncertainty. "I don't know what is me and what is responding to me. There's no map for this, Valor. My father gave me every book he could find on the bloodline, and every one of them ended the same way. Notes in different hands, generations apart, all saying the same thing. The power comes. It cannot be directed. It cannot be negotiated with. Everyone who ever carried this before me either destroyed themselves or destroyed everything around them, and the historical record stops there. The historical record always stops where the historians ran out of room to write." She looked at him sideways, brief, reading something in that. "Yes, that's correct." They reached the tree line and he slowed the horses to a walk, picking the path he had scouted 3 days ago when he had arrived in Arkenspire for the wedding. Because that was who he was. The kind of man who scouted exit routes before he walked into anything, even his own wedding, because 12 years of war had made the preparation as natural as breathing, because the day you stopped preparing was the day you turned a survivable situation into a final one. "Your father," he said. "Where is he?" "Alindra. I haven't been permitted to go home in 4 years. He sends letters." "Permitted by whom?" Her hands tightened on the reins. "That is a question I have been trying to answer for 4 years. He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead, at the path through the trees, and her profile in the wrong skylight was sharp and controlled, and he could see the effort it was taking to maintain that control. And he could see, beneath the effort, the outline of something that had been compressed for a very long time. There was a particular kind of damage that isolation produced. He had seen it in soldiers who had been separated from their units and forced to survive alone for extended periods. The way the social muscles atrophied, the way the capacity for ordinary trust eroded. Not because the person had become untrustworthy, but because trust required practice the way any other skill required practice, and isolation starved the practice. The person came back functional, competent, precise, capable of making every correct decision without hesitation, and completely unable to tell the difference between safety and danger at close range, because their calibration for that had been removed. He thought about Serafina in the ceremony hall, the way she had spoken to him throughout the rites, quiet and direct, and utterly without performance. The way she had not bothered to pretend she was less observant than she was. The way she had said, "I have not," historically, survived that particularly well, with the flat accuracy of someone reporting data on a stranger. She had been alone for a very long time, not just in the towers, alone in the specific way that happened when the people responsible for your safety were also the people defining the shape of your cage. He had not had the right thoughts about her before tonight. He acknowledged that without drama. He had had the correct political thoughts, the treaty, the alliance, the border stabilization that her province's resources would enable. He had not thought about what it had cost her to be the signature at the bottom of that document. He thought about it now. "The woman in the courtyard," he said. "Your suspicion." Serafina took a slow breath. "Her name is Maritha Vane. She was my father's court advisor for as long as I can remember. She was also the primary architect of the treaty negotiation that brought me north." A pause. "I trusted her once, when I was young enough that I didn't understand the difference between proximity and loyalty." The silence after that had weight. Veilor understood betrayal through trusted institutions. He had a particular and well-developed understanding of it, built from several distinct occasions, the first and most formative of which had occurred when he was 23 and had trusted his own council's intelligence assessments in a border engagement that had cost him 400 soldiers and nearly cost him his life. The intelligence had not been wrong by accident. The lesson he had taken from it was not cynicism. Cynicism was a lazy response to betrayal, the response of someone who had decided that the experience of being deceived was too expensive to risk repeating. Cynicism protected you from future pain by removing future possibility. The lesson he had actually taken was more precise. Trust was not a feeling. Trust was a conclusion reached through accumulated evidence. You did not give it in advance. You did not give it because someone was nearby, or necessary, or familiar. You gave it when the evidence supported it. He had not given it often. The evidence threshold was high. But when he gave it, it held. "She has resources," he said. "The order does. 30 trained operatives inside Arkenspire means the palace was penetrated at the planning level. Someone inside the wedding coordination had access. The treaty terms were drafted through my father's household, which Maritha Vane had access to." Yes, so she knew the ceremony structure, the blood-right timing, the exact moment your power would be most exposed. He worked through it as he spoke, the way he worked through tactical problems, letting the analysis move at the speed of the facts rather than faster. The anchor is designed to force awakening. She didn't want you dead before the rite completed. She wanted the rite to complete because the rite was what triggered the power, and the power is what the anchor needs to what? What does the anchor do when it hits an awakening? Serafina was quiet for a moment. In the tree canopy above them, birds had stopped moving. Everything was very still. "My father's books called it extraction," she said. "The anchor doesn't kill the carrier. It separates the power from the carrier, takes the celestial force out of the bloodline and—" She stopped. Her voice had gone careful in the specific way voices went careful when the speaker was maintaining control by keeping the language clinical. "Transfers it to the device, and whoever holds the device." The weight of that took a moment to settle. "She wasn't trying to kill you," he said. "No, she was trying to take it from you. Everything the Star Sovereign line can do, everything that started awakening in that hall, the ability to shape reality, to rewrite the conditions of the physical world." Her voice was very level. Give that to one person with no bloodline constraints, no inherited limitations, no anchor to human experience. Give it to someone who has spent 20 years cultivating a position inside the Order of the Void Crown. He did not need her to finish it. We stop for the night at the camp, he said. In the morning, we figure out how to move without being tracked. She'll have people between us and anywhere worth going. She'll have the people she brought to Arkenspire, 30, minus however many my commanders dealt with. She'll call for more, but calling for more takes time. He glanced at her. What are you feeling, right now? Inside. The question surprised her. He could tell because her hands adjusted on the reins. A micro-adjustment, the kind made unconsciously by someone recalibrating their posture after an unexpected stimulus. It's like she thought about it, which meant she took it seriously, did not deflect, which told him something. You know the feeling when you've been holding something heavy for a long time and your arms start to shake? Not from the weight, from the effort of not dropping it. Yes, it's that. But the thing I'm holding is the size of a... I don't have a comparison that fits. It's very large, and it has been large for a long time, and the right tonight made it much larger. Can you keep holding it? Tonight, yes. A breath. Tomorrow, I don't know. He nodded, accepted that, did not pretend it was a more comfortable answer than it was. The camp was 3 canvas structures in a shallow valley north of Arkenspire's hill, invisible from the road, staffed by 6 soldiers who answered only to him directly and who had been selected over 12 years for the specific combination of competence and discretion. They were not surprised to see him arrive at dusk with a woman in a torn wedding gown on a black horse. They had been selected partly for the quality of not being surprised by things. He got Serafina inside the largest structure, got a fire built in the iron stove at its center, got his shoulder looked at by his field medic. A deep cut, not structural, the kind that would be painful for 2 weeks and then be a scar among many, and dismissed the medic. He and Serafina sat across from each other at the camp table. She had pulled off the ceremonial jewelry somewhere during the ride. The dried blood on her palm from the right was still there. She looked at it while he poured water from the camp kettle, 2 cups, and pushed one toward her. Your council, she said. They don't know about this camp. No. How many people do you trust at that level? The level of this camp. The 6 outside. And me? He looked at her across the table. She was looking back at him with the stars in her eyes turned low. Not dimmed exactly, but quieter. The way a fire turned low was still fire, but no longer the thing that consumed the room. She was asking a real question, not performing confidence, not angling for reassurance. She genuinely wanted to know where she sat in his assessment. He liked that about her. He had been trying not to, because liking things about people created variables he had not accounted for, but he had run out of space to store the not liking. Conditionally, he said. What condition? You tell me what you know about your father's arrangement with Maritha Vane. She held his eyes, held them steadily, without the micro shifts that indicated someone preparing to redirect. I don't know the full arrangement. I know that the marriage negotiation came through his household. I know that Maritha was present at every discussion. I know that my father... A stop. Not evasion. The stop of someone locating accurate language for a complicated thing. My father is afraid. He has been afraid for as long as I can remember. Everything he did, the towers, the invisibility, the isolation, I believed it was protection. It may have been. It may also have been management. Of you. Of the asset he had. She said it without self-pity, which was the hardest way to say it and the most honest. A star sovereign who is hidden and contained and untrained is controllable. A star sovereign who awakens and knows what she is, that's a different kind of thing. My father may have believed he was protecting me. He may also have believed that I was safest as a tool someone else could point. And Maritha Vane was someone else. The Order has been waiting for an awakening for 3 generations. If you want to control a star sovereign's power, the cleanest method is to extract it at the moment of awakening before the carrier can develop any agency over it. My father may not have known that was the plan. Or he may have known exactly that. She picked up the water cup, drank, put it down. Her hand was steady. Veilor thought about fathers who managed their children like assets. He thought about what it did to a person to spend their formative years being shaped for someone else's purpose. He thought about the particular precision of the way Serafina spoke, and the calluses on her hand, and the speed with which she had matched his pace through the palace. All of it built in isolation, built in the specific shape of what was useful, what was survivable. He thought about what it meant that tonight, for the first time, she had not been managed. The fire in the stove cracked. Outside, wind moved through the valley. The stars in her eyes caught the stove light and held it, and he became aware that the pressure in the air, the pressure that had been building since the blood rite, that had spiked when he'd pulled her sideways from the anchor beam, that had not fully dissipated in the 2 hours since, was still present. Quieter, but present. Present and oriented in a specific direction. The bond, he said. Careful, precise. The one the rite created. Can you feel it? Her eyes dropped briefly to her palm, to the dried blood there, then back to him. Yes, she said. What does it feel like? A long silence. Not evasion, calculation. The calculation of someone deciding how honest to be, and deciding based on whatever evidence they were using to be completely honest. Like something is standing at the edge of a very deep drop, and it has found a handhold, something to grip. That hasn't existed before. She paused. It's inconvenient, given the circumstances. Inconvenient, he repeated. I have never had a handhold before, she said, and there was nothing in her voice but the fact of it. Not once. And now I have one in the worst possible situation, which means I need to be more careful than usual about how much weight I put on it. He understood the logic. He understood it precisely because he would have used the same logic. The things you depended on became the things that could be used against you. He had built an entire command philosophy around limiting his dependencies, around ensuring that the people who needed him could never be used to reach him. He also understood, sitting at this camp table with his shoulder bandaged, and 12 years of war behind him, and a dead-wrong sky full of the wrong stars outside, he understood that he had lost track, somewhere in the last few hours, of the line between assessment and something else. Something that had been in his wolf's voice 2 hours ago and had not gone quiet since. When the power builds past what you can hold, he said, what happens? I don't know. Best guess. She thought about it. Every star sovereign in the historical record reached a threshold point where the power stopped responding to the carrier's will and started expressing itself. The earlier ones, the ones who survived longer, they had anchors, things that tied them to a human experience, family, community, purpose. Her voice was even, careful. Without an anchor, the power becomes the whole identity. There's no self left to choose what it does. And every previous star sovereign lost their anchor. Everyone. How? She met his eyes. The stars in hers had stilled. They were taken, she said. The people they loved, the things they had, systematically, until there was nothing left but the power. A pause. The Order of the Void Crown did not become powerful by extracting star sovereign force from one carrier. They became powerful by ensuring that each carrier's anchor was removed before the anchor device was deployed. A star sovereign in full grief, in full isolation, with nothing human left, the power is not defended anymore. It's just there, waiting. Outside the camp, one of his soldiers called a word, not alarm, a routine check. The night sounds of a functioning perimeter. Normal. Nothing about tonight was normal. They're going to come for me, he said. She looked at him. The stars in her eyes were very still. Yes. The people around me, my council, my commanders, anyone I've given trust to. Yes. He absorbed that. Let it move through the part of him that had been making this kind of calculation for 12 years, the part that had gotten very practiced at assessing cost. The cost of what was coming. The cost of what staying close to him would mean for her. The cost of what staying close to her would mean for him. And he sat with the knowledge, clean and uncomfortable and completely clear, that none of the arithmetic changed what his wolf had already decided. Some things did not submit to calculation. He had spent a long time not believing that. He had spent a long time constructing his life so that everything submitted to calculation, because calculation was controllable, and controllable meant survivable. He picked up his water cup, drank, put it down. Get some sleep. I'll take first watch. Serafina looked at him for a moment. reading him the way she read everything, directly, without the performance of casualness. "You're not going to tell me what you decided just now." "I haven't decided anything." "You have," she said. Not accusation, observation. "I just don't know what it is yet." She stood, gathered the torn gown in one fist, and moved toward the cot at the far end of the structure. At the canvas divider, she stopped. "Valor?" "Yes, thank you. For the altar. For not letting go." He did not answer. She did not wait for one. He sat at the table alone for a long time, listening to the wrong stars outside, feeling the pressure in the air that had his wolf's full attention, running the arithmetic on a situation that had stopped being arithmetic the moment their blood had touched. At the 4th hour of the night, his most trusted outrider came through the canvas door with the expression of a man carrying information he did not want to carry. "Commander?" The outrider's name was Dreth, 12 years. The border engagements and the cold mornings and the long retreats. If there was evidence in the world, Dreth's face counted as evidence. "We have a problem." "Tell me." "Rider from the palace. Fresh. He says your inner council is requesting your return to Arkenspire." Dreth paused. The weight of the pause told Valor everything before the next sentence. "He also says Lord Casvin has called an emergency session. He's petitioning for the wedding to be declared invalid on the grounds that—" Another pause, the kind that braced for impact. "On the grounds that the bride is a known wielder of uncontrolled celestial force and therefore constitutes an active threat to the Empire." The fire cracked. Serafina was silent on the other side of the divider, but she was awake. He knew she was awake. "And if the petition succeeds," Valor said, already knowing, "she's to be surrendered to order custody for—" Dreth's voice went flat, the flatness of a man reading words he doesn't believe. "Containment and neutralization." The air pressure spiked. On the other side of the divider, something shifted. A sound like wind in a sealed room, like the moment before a storm identified itself as a storm. The stars through the camp's canvas ceiling, the wrong stars in the wrong sky, arranged themselves into a pattern Valor had not seen before. Casvin, his oldest counselor, 30 years of service, the man who had argued for the treaty, the man who had insisted on the Northern blood right inclusion, whose suggestion that had been, whose idea, who had arranged for them to be in that hall at that moment. Valor stood. "Tell the rider," he said, his voice carrying the specific quality it carried when 12 years of earned command weight were fully applied, "that the King of Vareth is occupied, and tell Lord Casvin that the next person who attempts to legislate the safety of my wife without my presence in the room will find themselves considerably less comfortable than they currently are." He walked to the canvas divider, pulled it aside. Serafina was sitting up on the cot, eyes open, fully awake, the stars in her eyes burning cold and bright. She had heard every word. She was looking at him with an expression that was not gratitude and was not relief, was something more complicated and more honest than either, the expression of someone recalculating a variable they had assumed was fixed. "My wife," she said. "You are. By Northern law, the rite completed. Your counselor doesn't agree." "My counselor," he said, "has made a significant error in his understanding of how far my patience extends." He held her eyes. The pressure in the air between them was the pressure of everything that had not been said yet and would need to be. Whatever is building inside you, the power, the awakening, it is going to keep building, and the Order knows exactly how much time we have before it becomes uncontrollable. Yes. Which means we do not have the luxury of careful. She held his gaze, steady, recalculating. "What are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything." He said it with the flatness of a man who had made a decision and was stating it, not opening it for review. "I'm telling you that what I said in that hall about strategy and caution, I meant it. And I'm also telling you that there are situations where strategy and caution are the wrong response, where waiting for more information is the thing that kills you." He paused. "The bond from the right. It's real. You feel it. I feel it. Whatever it is, it could be what anchors me," she said very quietly. "If it's real. If it holds. A bond to something human could be what keeps the power from consuming everything." "Yes. And if it fails?" Then we're in the same situation we're in now, but with better information. He watched her face. The order is going to move. Your council is already in motion. We have one night before the perimeter of options around us closes. He paused. What do you need? Something shifted in her face. Something that had been braced for a long time, for longer than tonight, longer than the towers and the letters and the managed invisibility. Something that had been braced because the shape of her world had required it, released very slightly. I need to know, she said, what you chose. At the table. Earlier. The fire was low, the wrong stars blazed. He told her. And somewhere in the hills north of Arkenspire, a wolf howled. His wolf, running in the part of him that had already been running toward this since the moment their blood touched. And the sky above the camp rearranged itself into a constellation that no living person recognized, because it had not appeared since the last time a star sovereign had found her anchor. And in the palace they had fled, Lord Casvin sealed an envelope with black wax and handed it to a rider in the colors of the Order of the Void Crown, and the rider disappeared into the wrong-starred night, and the message inside the envelope contained 2 words and a location that meant, by morning, the choice Valor had made at that table would become the point past which nothing, no negotiation, no council petition, no careful political arithmetic could carry them back. The point of no return had a name. It was the camp in the valley, and the Order already knew where it was. The Order found the camp before dawn. Valor heard them at the perimeter first, not because they were loud, but because Dreth's signal pattern, the 3-tap knock that meant all clear, had a half-second lag in it that meant Dreth was not making the signal freely. Someone was standing close enough to him to be a reason for the lag. He was already moving before the canvas door opened. The man who came through it was not Order. He was Palace Guard, gray and deep blue, Vareth colors, armor Valor had commissioned from the Eastern Forges 3 years ago. The man's name was Aldrich, and he had served at Arkenspire's inner gate for 11 years, and he was holding his sword at the carry position rather than the ready, which meant he had been briefed to appear non-threatening, which meant whoever had briefed him understood that appearing non-threatening was the fastest way to create the distance needed for a conversation that wouldn't otherwise happen. Behind Aldrich came 4 more guards. Behind them, Lord Casvin. Casvin was 63 years old, heavy through the shoulders in the way of men who had once been physically formidable and had allowed time and comfort to redistribute that formidability into something that merely suggested its former shape. He had a face that had been built for a particular kind of authority, the kind that worked best in council rooms, at long tables, across documents and ledgers, where the theater of power was conducted through tone and patience rather than anything more direct. Valor had known him for 14 years, had trusted him for 12 of those. Casvin looked around the camp with an expression of careful neutrality that Valor had seen him use in council sessions when the information on the table was damaging and he was buying himself time to construct a response. "My Lord King," Casvin said. The neutrality in the greeting told Valor everything. Not my king, not Valor, which was what 12 years permitted between men who had survived things together. My Lord King. The formal address. The address used when the relationship had shifted into something that required the protection of formality. You used the formal address, Valor said. The situation warrants it. The situation that you created. Casvin's expression did not change. That was the thing about men who had spent their lives in council chambers. They had practiced the elimination of readable response until it was no longer practice but nature. The situation that has placed the Empire in considerable jeopardy, jeopardy that requires, where is Dreth? A pause. The kind that was also an answer. Your outrider is secured. He isn't harmed. Where? He'll be released when we've concluded our conversation. Valor looked at the 4 guards behind Casvin. He ran the arithmetic fast, not because he needed to decide anything, but because not running arithmetic was how people ended up without options. 4 guards, 1 lord, himself, a camp knife in his right boot, approximately 8 feet of distance between him and the nearest threat. Serafina was behind the canvas divider. The canvas divider was very thin. He did not look at it. Conclude it, he said. Casvin moved to the camp table, as if the invitation to sit had been issued and he was accepting it. He did not sit. He stood at the table's edge and looked at Violor with the expression of a man who has done a difficult thing and has decided, in the doing of it, that difficulty is the same as necessity. "You know what she is," Casvin said. "I know her name. I know her bloodline. I know considerably more about her than I knew this morning, which is a failure of preparation that I intend to address with the people responsible for my pre-wedding intelligence briefings. You know what the bloodline means, what it produces." Casvin placed both hands flat on the table. It was a gesture Valor had seen him use in council rooms when he was about to say something he believed was true and irrefutable. "Valor, I have served this throne for 30 years. I served your father. I have watched empires collapse and been part of building this one into something that has survived 12 years of wars that should have ended it. I am not your enemy." "People who are not my enemies," Valor said, "do not have my outriders secured. People who are not your enemy sometimes make decisions that feel like opposition because they are trying to prevent a larger harm." Casvin's voice was level, practiced level, the kind of level that required active maintenance. "The woman in that camp, whatever you feel toward her, whatever the right created between you, she is a catastrophe waiting to express itself. The historical record on the Star Sovereign line is not ambiguous. Every single awakening in recorded history ended in mass destruction. Every one. The power is not containable by an individual will. The bond you have formed may delay the inevitable, but it will not." "Stop." Casvin stopped. "You argued for the Northern Right," Valor said, "in the council session 3 weeks ago. You were the one who suggested it be included. Not me. I had intended a standard Southern ceremony." He watched Casvin's face, watched it the way he watched terrain, for the place where the ground was wrong. "You insisted. You said it would strengthen the treaty's legitimacy in the eyes of the northern provinces. You had a full argument prepared. I remember being slightly surprised by how prepared it was." Casvin did not answer immediately. And in that space, Violor felt the full shape of it arrive. Not piece by piece. All at once, the way battle clarity arrived. Not a sequence of deductions, but a simultaneous recognition, every element present at once, the whole picture arriving complete and irreversible. The right had been Casvin's idea. The blood mingling, the specific moment of exposure, had been engineered into the ceremony by the man standing at this table. The order had known exactly when to deploy the anchor because the timing of the awakening had been made predictable, made controllable, by someone inside the planning structure. 30 years of service. 12 years of wars survived together. The man who had helped build Vareth's northern empire into something that had outlasted every prediction of its collapse. The thing about betrayal through trusted institutions was that it almost never announced itself. It did not arrive in the form of a stranger with a sword. It arrived in the form of someone you had eaten breakfast with, someone whose habits you knew, someone whose argument you trusted because the architecture of the trust had been built carefully and over time, and you had never had reason to examine the foundation, because the foundation had been designed to be invisible. Valor had understood this abstractly for years. He had made his command decisions accordingly. The camp the council didn't know about, the outriders who answered only to him, the habit of keeping final decisions internal until the last necessary moment. He had understood that proximity was not loyalty and familiarity was not safety. But understanding something abstractly and standing inside the specific instance of it were different experiences in the way that understanding the concept of fire and having your hand in one were different experiences. "You arranged the right timing," Valor said. Not a question. Casvin was quiet for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time for a man of his composure. "I arranged for the awakening to occur under conditions that could be managed," he said. "The alternative was allowing the power to emerge unpredictably, at a moment of the bloodline's choosing, in a location and context where it would be impossible to contain. What I did was, you arranged for Marethavain and 30 Order operatives to be present at my wedding ceremony. You arranged for the anchor to be deployed at the moment of maximum vulnerability." Valor's voice was level, the kind of level that was not practiced but structural, the voice of a man who had passed through shock and come out the other side into something colder. "You arranged for her to be here so that the Order could take what it wants from her, and when that failed, you came here to try again. The Order's method is not what I did not intend for her to be harmed in the extraction process. What Maritha Vane planned was not. Kesvin's composure fractured along one line, just slightly. I intended containment, safe containment, in a facility where the power could be managed without destroying her or anyone around her. What I did not intend was for you to form a bond with her. That variable was not. You did not intend for me to think of her as a person. The words landed flat and final. Kesvin's mouth closed. This was the thing that betrayal through trusted systems did that pure betrayal by an enemy could not. It did not just destroy the specific thing it targeted. It retroactively rewrote every preceding moment, every decision made in good faith, every battle chosen on the basis of intelligence provided by the betrayer. It went backward through time and poisoned it. 12 years of wars. Every decision Valor had made through Kesvin's counsel. How many of those decisions had been shaped by information Kesvin had filtered, emphasized, withheld? How many of the border engagements, the alliance negotiations, the troop deployments? How many had served Vareth's interests specifically? And how many had served a longer calculation that Valor had not been invited to understand? Power was never simply the authority to command. Power was information. Power was the knowledge of what was real and what was constructed and which version of reality you were operating inside. The moment someone controlled your information, they controlled your decisions. And the moment they controlled your decisions, the authority you believed you held was simply a theater that they were allowing you to perform. He had been performing. For how long was a question he could not afford to spend time on right now? I need you to leave this camp, Valor said. Kesvin straightened. My Lord King, I am asking you, as a man who has served this throne with everything he had for 30 years, do not let what you feel in this moment override what you know. The Star Sovereign line has destroyed everything it touched. It will destroy you. Whatever that bond is, it is not stronger than what is coming. You have 2 minutes to be beyond my perimeter before the conversation changes character. Valor, 1 minute and 50 seconds. Kesvin looked at him for a long moment. The practiced neutrality was gone. What was underneath it was not malice, which was the thing that made it complicated, the thing that made it harder than simple treachery, the thing that would cost Valor something to carry forward. What was underneath Kesvin's neutrality was genuine conviction. He believed what he had done was necessary. He believed it the way a surgeon believed in cutting, not because he enjoyed the damage, but because he had decided the alternative damage was larger. And he was not entirely wrong about what the Star Sovereign power could do. That was the cruelest part. Kesvin left. The 4 guards left. The canvas door fell closed. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. The canvas divider moved and Serafina came through it, and her face was doing something it had not done in all the hours since the ceremony. Not the controlled precision, not the flat accuracy, not the performance of composure over something larger. Her face was doing what faces did when the thing a person had suspected but had not allowed themselves to believe was confirmed, and the confirmation was both terrible and somehow easier than the suspension of not knowing. How much did you hear? He said. Enough. She moved to the camp table and put both hands on it and looked at the surface of it for a moment, and he could see her working through it. The same process he had gone through, the retroactive rewrite, the recalculation of every preceding assumption. For her, it went further back. It went back to a father's household, to an advisor who had been proximity before loyalty, to crystal towers that had been framed as protection. My father didn't know, she said. Not a question. A conclusion she had reached and was stating. He genuinely believed the towers were safety. Maritha managed his information the same way Kesvin managed yours. A breath. Which means my father has been living inside a construction for 20 years, believing he was protecting me, believing the arrangement he made was the safest possible option. Grief-stricken people make predictable decisions, Valor said. That's not an excuse, but it's a mechanism. He lost my mother when I was born. She died in the first resonance, the first sign of the power expressing itself. He's been afraid since before I was old enough to know what fear was. Her voice was absolutely steady, which was the wrong kind of steady, the kind that was not calm but the absence of a reaction that hadn't found its form yet. And someone saw that fear and built a 20-year arrangement on top of it. Outside the camp, Valor could hear his soldiers at the perimeter. Kesvin had taken the palace guards with him. The immediate threat had withdrawn. The larger threat, The rider Casvin had sent, the order knowing the camp's location, was still operational. "We can't stay here," Valor said. "No, we can't go back to Arkenspire. Not until I know who in my council is operating independently and who is still—" He stopped. The scale of the recalculation was larger than he had time to fully conduct right now. "Not until I know who I can stand in a room with." Serafina lifted her head from the table's surface. The stars in her eyes had been quiet during the conversation with Casven. He had been peripherally aware of that, had noted it. But they were moving again now, steady and slow, the way they moved when she was thinking rather than suppressing. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "The anchor missed last night. Maritha knows it missed. She also knows the blood rite completed, which means she knows that the bond formed." She looked at him directly. "The bond changes the extraction calculus. An unanchored awakening is controllable with the anchor because there's nothing defending the power. A star sovereign, with an anchor, with a genuine bond to something human, the power has a source of resistance. Extracting it would require removing the anchor first." Yes, the sentence required no elaboration. Valor ran the logic through its full chain. If the bond between them was what could stabilize her awakening, and if the awakening was what the order needed to extract, then the order's revised strategy was self-evident. You did not attack the power directly. You removed what protected it. You removed the anchor. You removed him, which Casven had already understood, which was why Casven had come to the camp, not with a full assault force, but with 5 guards and a conversation. Because Casven was not trying to destroy Valor. Casven was trying to separate them, persuade Valor to stand down, to step back from the bond, to allow the containment to proceed without the complication of a king's resistance. And if persuasion failed, the next stage was already in motion. "He sent a rider last night," Valor said. "The order knows we're here." They knew before Casven arrived. He came here to buy time for a second force to position. He was moving already, shrugging on his field coat, checking the camp knife in his boot. "Dreth." He went through the door. Outside, dawn was just beginning to gray the valley's edges, and the wrong stars were fading. Not because morning was erasing them, but because something was pulling them back. The same something that was building in Serafina. The power receding back into itself the way a tide receded, gathering for something larger. Dreth was at the north edge of the camp perimeter, seated on the ground with his hands bound in front of him. Palace guards had not secured him with order rope. They'd used camp cord, which was good for its purpose, but not good for preventing a man who had spent 12 years in border engagements from working it loose, given time. Dreth looked up when Valor came through the tree line. His expression was the expression of a man who had survived an embarrassing situation by handling it with absolute professionalism, and was waiting for acknowledgement of that. "How long?" Valor said, crouching and cutting the cord. "They came in from the eastern slope. 6 of them, palace colors, but the one giving orders was order." Dreth flexed his hands. "I counted at least 12 more positioned at the valley's southern mouth before they took my sight lines. They'll have the northern exit covered as well." They came in behind Casven, used his approach as a distraction. Valor stood. "How long before they tightened the position?" "They were waiting for dawn. Better sightlines, maybe 30 minutes. 30 minutes was enough and not enough simultaneously, which was the characteristic condition of most of the tactical situations Valor had operated inside for the past 12 years, and he had learned to work within it rather than waiting for it to improve. He went back to the camp. Serafina had the horses ready. She had also, he noted, found a camp blade from the gear stores and secured it at her hip, which she had done without being instructed to, which confirmed a thing he had suspected about the practical content of her tower education. "East slope," he said. "Then north. We need to clear the valley before they compress the position. And after the valley, I have a contact in the Ashvin province, 3 days north. She owes me a debt that predates the border wars and is not connected to anyone in my current council structure." "She," Serafina said, "former intelligence operative. She retired to Ashvin when the Second Border War ended. She built a network up there that I've never formally acknowledged the existence of." He met Serafina's eyes. "She's the kind of person who does not appear in any record that Casven would have access to. You kept her separate. I keep everything that matters separate." They moved. The eastern slope was steep and tree-covered. the kind of terrain that slowed organized movement and favored people who were motivated differently from people following orders. Order soldiers followed orders. They had tactics, positions, protocols. What they did not have was the specific and highly focused motivation of two people for whom the valley's southern mouth was not an option. The stars overhead were fully gone now, replaced by the gray pre-dawn that preceded actual morning, and the land around them felt less aware. Whatever had been paying attention last night had drawn back, had contracted, had returned to wherever it lived when it was not being called into expression by the building pressure inside Serafina, who was running beside him through the trees without complaint, matching pace over uneven ground, not announcing her discomfort with the terrain or the darkness or the situation. He had stopped being surprised by this. He had started, some hours ago, in some accumulation of small observations, simply including it in the working model of who she was. They cleared the valley's eastern ridge as the first actual light began, and below them the camp was visible, and he could see the Order's repositioning forces closing in on the position they had just vacated, which meant the timing had been correct, which was the only kind of correct that mattered. They did not stop. He pushed the pace north into the lower reaches of the Ashfin foothills, where the trees grew old and close and the paths required local knowledge to navigate without losing 2 hours to wrong turns. He had local knowledge. He had made a point of acquiring it 3 years ago on a supply route inspection that his council had been told was about road conditions. 3 hours into the run, Serafina pulled up. He stopped, turned. She was standing at the edge of a shallow creek crossing, and her hands were at her sides, and the expression on her face was the expression he had seen briefly in the ceremony hall when the power had first moved. Not pain, not panic, but the total internal force stillness of someone holding something that was demanding release. "It's building," she said. "Can you hold it?" "Not," she breathed. "Not the way I've been holding it. I've been holding it by treating it like a structural problem, like a load-bearing problem. Like if I keep the right internal architecture, it stays contained." Her jaw was tight. The architecture is starting to fail. He crossed the creek and came to her, stood close. The pressure in the air between them was the same pressure it had been since the blood rite, but denser now, concentrated, directional, the way pressure worked when the containing structure was developing fracture lines. "What does it need?" he said. She looked at him. The stars in her eyes were the brightest he had seen them, brighter than the ceremony hall, brighter than the camp, moving fast, the constellations shifting and rewriting themselves in patterns that changed too quickly to memorize. "I think," she said carefully, "that it needs to trust something. The power, it's not separate from me. It's not something I'm carrying. It is me, or it's the largest part of me, and it's been held down for so long without any—" She stopped, started again. "An anchor doesn't work by force. The histories were wrong about that. A star sovereign can't hold the power down through will alone, through structural discipline. That's what everyone before me tried. That's why they all—" Her hands came up and she pressed them against her sternum, against the place where the building pressure was most concentrated. "The anchor works by giving the power something to be, something other than everything, something human-sized." He understood what she was saying, not the abstract of it, the specific application. The bond from the blood rite was already there. It had been there since their palms met. But a bond was not an anchor until it was acknowledged, until both sides of it brought their weight to it deliberately, until it was something chosen rather than something merely formed. The hardest thing a man built from discipline and distance and 12 years of controlled self-sufficiency could do was not charge a fortified position with inferior numbers. It was this. "Then stop holding it," he said. She stared at him. "Not holding it at me," he said. "Don't release it. Let it find what it's looking for. The anchor. Let it reach. If I do that and the bond isn't strong enough to hold it, then we're in the same situation in 30 minutes when the architecture fails on its own." He held her eyes. The stars in them were blazing. "I'm not asking you to trust the bond blindly. I'm telling you that I chose it, at that table, deliberately, which means it has my full weight on this side." Serafina Valhart was a woman who had survived by calculating precisely what she could rely on. She had spent her life in a world that called itself protection while practicing management, that called itself safety while practicing control. and she had learned to identify the difference between proximity and loyalty at the exact same cost as everyone who had ever learned that difference, which was the cost of learning it the hard way. She looked at him, and she chose. The power unfolded, not explosively, not the way the ceremony hall had shattered, not the way the sky had rewritten itself in wrong constellations. It unfolded the way a fist that has been clenched for a very long time unclenches. Slow, structural, the release of tension so deep and so old that the unclenching itself takes time. The air around her lit, cold white. The creek beside them reflected stars that were not in the sky yet. The trees went still in a way that was not wind stillness. And then it found the bond, and the bond held. And what happened then was not dramatic in the way that battlefields were dramatic. It was the opposite of drama. It was the stillness of a foundation being completed. Valor felt it through the bond like a weight pressing against his chest from the inside. Enormous, cold, ancient beyond his frame of reference. The weight of something that had been alone for a very long time pressing against the weight of someone who understood what it was to stand alone and had decided for the first time not to. He did not move. He held. Serafina exhaled, long, ragged, the exhalation of someone who had been holding their breath for years. The light faded. Not gone, banked, contained, no longer holding itself by force but simply resting, held within the bond the way a banked fire was held within a hearth. She was shaking, not violently, the fine tremor of someone whose body had been at maximum tension for so long that the relaxation of that tension had nowhere comfortable to land. He put his hand on her arm. She did not pull away. "How long do we have?" he said. She understood what he was asking. The window before the bond was tested, before the power built back to critical, before the next threshold demanded another choice. Days. Maybe a week if nothing forces another surge. A breath. The bond needs to be deeper to hold it long term. What we have now is enough, but not permanently enough. Days. He had worked with worse windows. He also knew, and filed it without examining it too directly, because examining it fully would require time he did not have right now, that the deeper bond she was describing had a name in Northern tradition, and the name was not political, and the cost of it was permanent, and he had chosen it at a camp table approximately 6 hours ago. "North," he said. "We keep moving." She gathered herself, straightened. The precision returned to her face, but it was different precision now. Not the precision of someone compressing something enormous into an invisible container, but the precision of someone who had put down an enormous weight and was recalibrating to their own actual strength. They crossed the creek. They were 2 hours into the Ashfin foothills when Valor's forward instincts, not calculation, not observation, the wolf's version of information that arrived before it could be sourced, made him stop. The path ahead was a narrow cut between two rock formations, the kind of natural choke point that made travel faster and made ambush trivially easy. He had evaluated this path 3 days ago as low risk. 3 days ago, no one with hostile intent had known his Ashfin contact or the route to reach her. He looked at the choke point. He thought about who specifically had been present 3 years ago when he had planned the Ashfin route. He thought about which council members had been told the inspection was about road conditions. He thought about Casvin. He thought about the 30-year architecture of a trust that had been built to hold weight and had been holding the wrong weight. And he understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has learned something irrevocable about the shape of the world he had been living in, that the contact in Ashfin was not unknown to the Order. She had been left unknown for exactly as long as was useful, and the path ahead was a natural choke point. He turned to Serafina. She was already looking at it. She had already reached the same conclusion from a different direction, through a different 12 years of education, but the conclusion was the same. "We can't go to Ashfin," he said. "No." "Every route I know," he said slowly, working it through the full length of the chain, "was planned through Casvin's counsel." "Yes." "Which means every route I know is potentially compromised." "Yes." He stood in the Ashfin foothills with the wrong stars gone, and the morning fully arrived and the world arranged in a shape he had spent 12 years building and which had, overnight, revealed itself to be someone else's construction. Every exit he had prepared, every contingency he had engineered, every fallback position and alternative route and trusted contact, all of it developed through a council structure that had been penetrated before he had a name for the penetration. The man who had spent 12 years surviving by refusing to be without options was, for the first time in 12 years, looking at a map in which every option he could identify had been designed for someone else's purpose. He looked at Serafina. She looked back at him. And he understood that what was required now was not a tactical adjustment. Tactical adjustment was what you did when the situation was fundamentally sound and required modification. What was required now was something that broke every rule of his own command philosophy, every careful, calibrated, survival-built principle that had carried him through 12 years of impossible odds. What was required now was to become something he had never let himself be. Unpredictable. Not to his enemy, to himself. Unpredictable meant starting from nothing, not from a reduced set of options, not from a compromised map with the compromised routes removed. From nothing. From the bare fact of two people standing in the Ashfin foothills with two horses and the contents of a field pack and a bond that was holding but not permanent, and the knowledge that every structure Valor had built his survival on had been someone else's architecture. He stood at the choke point between the rock formations and let himself feel the full weight of that for approximately 30 seconds. Not because he had time for it, but because refusing to feel it would have cost him accuracy. And accuracy was the only currency that still had value. 12 years of prepared exits, gone. 30 years of a trusted advisor, gone. The intelligence network, the fallback positions, the contact in Ashfin, the camp the council didn't know about. That last one had held for one night before Casvin walked through its door, which meant the camp had been known from the moment it was established, which meant the illusion of the council not knowing had itself been a managed condition. 30 seconds. Then he turned to Serafina. "What do you know?" he said. "That didn't come from your father's household." She understood the question immediately. What information did she hold that had not passed through the same managed channel, that Maritha Vane had not touched, that was genuinely hers? She thought about it with the seriousness it warranted. "The books my father gave me were old enough that the information in them predated the Order's current structure by at least 2 generations. The military history. The bloodline records." She paused. "There are places mentioned in the oldest text. Locations associated with the Star Sovereign line before the Order existed to pursue it. Sanctuaries, or what functioned as sanctuaries, built specifically for an awakening that needed to stabilize rather than be suppressed. Where? The text called it the Varethian Deep North, past the Ashfin Range into what the old records called the Stone Reach." She watched his face. "You know it." "I know it's not on any administrative map of Vareth, which means it predates the Empire." "Yes, which means it predates everything Casvin had access to." He looked north. The Ashfin foothills rose into rock and distance, and beyond them the range proper began. Serious terrain, the kind that required 3 days of hard travel in summer conditions, and considerably more in anything else. Terrain that had not been pacified or mapped by any military expedition in living memory, because there was nothing up there that anyone had previously needed badly enough to justify the cost of getting to it. Which was, he understood, the point. "Can you find it?" he said. "Without the books. From memory." "I memorized everything my father gave me. I had nothing else to do." She said it without self-pity, the flat statement of a fact about the conditions of her life. "Yes, I can find it." He made the decision in the space between one breath and the next. Not because it was comfortable, not because it matched any principle in his command philosophy, because it was the only route available that had not been walked before him by someone with a different agenda. "North," he said. "We go up." The Ashfin Range at altitude was a different world from the foothills. The trees thinned within the first 2 hours of climbing and then stopped entirely, replaced by rock and scrub and the kind of cold that had no interest in the season below. Valor's field coat was built for northern conditions. He had worn it through 3 winters on the border, but the cut on his shoulder, which had been a manageable inconvenience at lower elevation, began communicating its displeasure more specifically as the temperature dropped and the bandage stiffened. He did not slow the pace. There was a particular skill that developed in men who spent years operating under sustained physical pressure, not the ability to ignore pain, which was a fantasy promoted by people who had never experienced serious pain, but the ability to establish a functional partition between the part of the mind tracking what the body reported and the part making operational decisions. Pain went into the partition. It was real. It was noted. It did not participate in the decisions. He had built that partition over 12 years and it was solid. What he had not built a partition for was the awareness of the bond. It was present every moment in a way that was not intrusive but was impossible to ignore. A constant peripheral awareness. The way you were always aware of someone walking beside you, even when you weren't looking at them. A weight and warmth and presence that had no analog in anything his previous experience had given him vocabulary for. His wolf had stopped being restless about it. His wolf was doing something that felt uncomfortably like satisfaction, which was an emotion he had not associated with his wolf's communications in a long time. He paid attention to the terrain instead. The stone reach began 3 hours into the climb, where the rock changed character, stopped being the gray-brown limestone of the lower range, and became something older, darker, with a crystalline structure that caught light at angles that did not correspond to the light's actual direction. Serafina had described it from the texts, and the description was accurate, and he filed that accuracy as further evidence in the working model he was building. The text said the reach would respond to the bloodline, Serafina said. She was a step behind him, navigating the same uneven footing with the same absence of complaint. That it was built to. The people who constructed the sanctuary were not star sovereigns themselves, but they had studied the bloodline long enough to engineer spaces that resonated with it. As if responding to the description, the crystalline rock around them flickered. Not with light, with something below light, a vibration in the structure of the stone that was felt rather than seen, a hum that bypassed the ears and arrived directly in the chest. "That's it," she said. "How far?" The text described it as a day's travel from where the stone changes. I don't know if that means a day at their pace or, "We'll find it before dark. Move." They found it in 5 hours. It was not dramatic, which was the thing that struck him most about it. He had expected something architecturally significant. Towers, gates, some structure that announced its own importance. What they found was a depression in the rock face, roughly circular, perhaps 40 feet across, open to the sky, with walls of the crystalline stone rising 20 feet on 3 sides and a natural overhang on the 4th that created a shallow shelter. In the center of the depression, a still pool, fed by some underground source perfectly clear. That was all. And yet the moment they stepped inside it, the world changed. Not visibly, not dramatically. The pressure that had been building in the bond, the slow accumulation of the power pressing against its containing structure, eased. Not gone. Not resolved. But eased. The way a held breath eased when the person holding it was finally in a place where breathing was permitted. Serafina stopped at the pool's edge and stood absolutely still. "It's designed to slow the progression," she said. "The awakening. This place, the stone, whatever is in the stone, it gives the power something external to rest against, instead of the carrier having to hold everything internally. How long will it hold? Days. Long enough to figure out what comes next." She turned to face him. The stars in her eyes were quiet for the first time since the ceremony hall, moving slowly, settled. "Valor, I need to tell you something." He waited. "The deeper bond," she said, "what it requires. I know you know what it is in Northern tradition. I know you chose it at the camp table. I'm not asking you to confirm it or to move toward it before you're ready." She held his eyes. "I'm telling you that what it will do, what it will cost, it's not just political, and it's not just about anchoring the power. If we form it fully, we are changed. Both of us. What I carry becomes partly yours to carry. What you are becomes partly mine to hold." A breath. "I have never had anything to hold before. I may not be adequate to the weight." He looked at her across the still pool in the depression of ancient crystalline rock, with the wrong sky stars just beginning to appear again at the edges of the early evening, and he thought about adequacy. He thought about the particular lie embedded in the question of whether a person was adequate to a weight. The assumption that adequacy was a fixed quality rather than something built, something that developed through the practice of holding, through the accumulated evidence of having held before. He thought about a woman who had memorized every book she was given because she had nothing else to do, and who had chosen to tell him that with the same flat accuracy she used for everything, because performance was something she had never been taught and had apparently decided not to learn. The weight doesn't need you to be adequate to it from the beginning, he said. It needs you to not drop it when it gets heavy. And if I'm afraid I might, then you tell me when it gets heavy. He held her gaze. That's the whole of it. She was quiet for a long moment. All right, she said. And somewhere in the bond between them, something that had been held at a careful distance closed that distance, and the power in her settled deeper into its holding, and the evening came down around the stone reach in the particular silence of a place that had been built to protect something enormous, and had been waiting a long time to do its job. They made camp at the overhang. Small fire. He had enough in the field pack for 2 days if they were careful. He took first watch while she slept, sitting at the depression's entrance, his back against the crystalline stone, feeling the hum of it through his shoulder blade and the bond through everything else. And he thought about what they were going to have to do when morning came, because the stone reach was not a permanent solution. It was a delay. And in the days it provided, the order would be restructuring, Casvin would be managing the council, and the empire that Violor was ostensibly king of would be operating on information and decisions he had no visibility into. He had spent 12 years building something, and in one night, he had discovered that the building had been partially constructed on land that belonged to someone else. The question now was not how to recover what had been compromised. Compromised intelligence could not be uncompromised. Compromised trust could not be unexperienced. The question was what kind of structure you built when you had to start from the truth of what the ground actually was, rather than what you had believed it to be. A different kind of structure, built differently, from the beginning. He sat with that through the dark hours, and the stars above the stone reach, the right stars, the actual nighttime stars that belonged in the sky they occupied, moved in their slow arc, and the bond held, and the power rested, and somewhere well below them in the Ashfen foothills, order soldiers were repositioning. He knew it with the certainty of a man who had spent his life understanding how forces moved. They were coming. The anchor was coming. Maritha Vane was coming. The only question was how much time the Reach had bought. The answer was 36 hours. He heard them at the depression's entrance at the second dawn, not their footfalls. The rock transmitted nothing so direct, but the change in the quality of the silence that came when trained people were trying to be silent. There were many of them, more than the 30 from the ceremony. Reinforced. He was already on his feet when Serafina woke. She read his posture and was standing in 2 seconds. How many? More than we can fight directly. He was pulling on his coat, checking the camp blade. They're at the Reach's entrance, maybe 3 minutes before the first ones come through. She looked at him. He looked at her. This was the moment. He had spent the 36 hours in the Reach thinking about the deeper bond and its cost. And he had spent approximately 12 of those hours understanding what it would require of him specifically, the parts of himself that had been built as walls, as partition, as the careful distance between his interior and any external claim on it. Those walls had been load-bearing in the architecture of his survival. Taking them down was not a small thing. Taking them down in a 3-minute window with an order strike force at the entrance was either the worst possible timing or exactly the right forcing function, and he had always operated better under pressure than without it. The bond, he said. Now, if you're willing. She didn't hesitate. Yes. He crossed to her. He put his hand on the side of her face, and she let him, and he felt the bond reach for the depth it needed the way a root reached for water, not grasping, not desperate, but with the certainty of a thing that had been thirsty for a long time and had found the right direction at last. The power responded. Not the building surge of the ceremony hall, not the uncontrolled flood of the creek crossing. Something different. Something that felt like the difference between a river overflowing its banks and a river finding its channel. The same force, the same volume, directed. Held. Given a shape that matched both its own nature and the shape of what contained it. Velor felt it enter the bond and he held it without moving, the way he held a blade's weight without letting it tip him. Not by force, but by balance, by understanding where the center of gravity was and positioning himself relative to it. His wolf met it and did not flinch. The power felt his wolf, and something in it, something ancient and enormous and utterly without experience of being met, went still, not suppressed, recognized. The crystalline stone around them blazed white. The still pool reflected stars that were not in the daytime sky. The overhang above them groaned and then steadied, as if the structure that had been built to wait for this moment had shifted itself to accommodate it. The First Order soldiers came through the depression entrance. There were 8 in the first wave. Armored, weapons drawn, formation trained. They came through the narrow entrance at speed and spread into the space with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. They stopped. The light from the stone was not aggressive. It did not blind or burn, but it had weight. A specific directional weight that moved through the chest like sound moved through water, reaching the center before the ears understood it was arriving. The soldiers at the entrance stood in it and made the faces of people whose bodies were responding to something their training had not prepared them for. Hold the position. The voice from behind the formation was Maritha Vane's. She came through the entrance last, and she was holding the anchor, and the anchor was calibrated and powered and ready, and her face had the expression of a woman who had spent 20 years working toward a single outcome and was close enough to it now to taste it. She looked at Serafina. She looked at Veilor. She looked at the blazing stone and the bond between them and the way the power was sitting. Not surging, not wild, contained within a structure that had not been there 36 hours ago. A structure she had not planned for and could not have planned for, because planning for it would have required believing it was possible, and she had built her entire 20-year architecture on the historical evidence that it was not. "Separate them," she said to her soldiers. Nobody moved. The weight in the air was not threatening, but it was real in a way that stopped feet from moving, that made the gap between the instruction and the execution wider than it should have been, because executing the instruction required closing distance on something that every animal instinct was reporting as fundamentally wrong to approach. Maritha Vane raised the anchor. "I'll manage the separation myself," she said. The thing about an anchor, the thing Serafina had described in the camp, the thing he had filed and held, was that it worked by targeting the specific resonance of the star sovereign force. It pulled the power out of its source by identifying the signature of the source and applying counterpressure at the point of origin. The point of origin previously had been Serafina alone. The bond had changed the point of origin. He understood this in the moment before Maritha fired, and whether Serafina understood it simultaneously or whether she arrived at it through a different path did not matter, because they arrived at the same place at the same time, which was the nature of a fully formed bond. And what they arrived at was this: the anchor was built for one source. The bond had made 2. Maritha Vane fired. The beam came out with the same not-light quality as before, bending, seeking, correcting toward its target signature. And it found the signature, which was now distributed across 2 people, across a bond that had the crystalline stone of the reach beneath it, and the ancient resonance of the sanctuary's design around it, and 12 years of a wolf's patient certainty behind it. And the beam hit that distributed signature, and something happened that had not happened in any of Maritha Vane's 20 years of study and preparation. It split. The power, instead of being pulled, absorbed the extraction force and used it. The way fire used wind, not resisted by it, not extinguished by it, but fed by it, made larger, given oxygen. The depression blazed. The Order soldiers went back through the entrance in approximately 4 seconds, which was the fastest coordinated retreat Veilor had witnessed at close range in 12 years of watching trained soldiers make tactical decisions. Maritha Vane did not retreat. She was staring at the anchor in her hand, and the anchor was dark. Not powered down, dark, the crystal structure that had been pulsing with the light of the force it carried now inert, emptied. The stored power that had taken 20 years to accumulate drawn out of it in one redirected pulse and dissolved into the bond's resonance. "That's not—" She looked up. Her composure, which had been the composure of a woman who had outmaneuvered every obstacle she had ever faced through patience and preparation, was showing its first fracture. "That's not possible. The bond is too new. The power hasn't stabilized enough to—" "You built your understanding on incomplete data," Serafina said. Her voice was steady in a way that was different from all its previous steadiness. Not held steady, actually steady. The steadiness of something that has found its level. Every star sovereign in your records failed to stabilize because every one of them was alone. You treated the isolation as a variable. It was the determining condition. Maritha's jaw worked. Then, very quietly, to herself rather than to them. 30 years. Take your soldiers and go, Valor said. She looked at him. The intelligence in her eyes was still there. Undiminished, exact. The intelligence of a woman who had spent 30 years constructing a plan that had just been invalidated at its most critical point. She was already, he could see it, calculating what remained. What remained was Casvin. What remained was a council in Arkenspire making decisions in the king's absence. What remained was 30 years of order, infrastructure, and resources that did not disappear because a single engagement had gone wrong. This isn't finished, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. The council will declare the marriage invalid. Casvin has the votes. Without the throne's protection, The council, Valor said, and the flatness in his voice was the flatness of a man naming something he is about to change rather than something he is observing, is going to discover that the king has some opinions about the scope of its authority. Maritha Vane looked at them for a long moment. She looked at the blazing stone, at the empty anchor in her hand, at the formation she had brought into the depression and which had already decided to be somewhere else. She looked at the still pool and the morning light moving through the crystalline walls and the bond between the two people in front of her that had done something her 20 years of preparation had told her was structurally impossible. She left. The depression went quiet. Not the waiting quiet of before, a different quiet. The quiet of a space that has done what it was made to do. Valor looked at Seraphina. She was trembling. Fine, deep, the tremor of someone whose body had been at maximum engagement and was now processing the aftermath. Her eyes were brighter than he had ever seen them. Not the panicked brightness of the ceremony hall or the desperate brightness of the creek crossing, but something settled and blazing simultaneously, the brightness of a thing that had found its right expression. She looked at him with those eyes, and he held her gaze, and the bond sat between them with the solidity of something built for weight. "The council," she said. "Yes. Casvin will move fast. If he declares the marriage invalid before you're back in Arkenspire, he will. He knows we're alive. He knows the anchor failed, and he has a window before I'm back in the room." He was already running the timing. 2 days down from the reach, Casvin would know about the failed engagement within hours. He would move the council session forward. He has probably already started the process. "Then we need to move." "We need to move," he agreed. "Valor." She stepped toward him. Close. The bond at close range was a specific experience, not overwhelming, not destabilizing, but dense, like standing in a room where the gravity was slightly more than expected. "What you said. About the weight. About telling you when it gets heavy." "Yes. It's heavy," she said simply. "Right now, the last 2 days. Casvin and the anchor and what we just did with the bond. All of it." She held his eyes. "I'm telling you." He did not have a practiced response for this, because he had built his life specifically to not need practiced responses for this. He had built his life so that the partitions held and the dependencies were minimal and the things that could be used against him were few. He reached out and took her hand. The same hand, the left, with the dried blood of the ceremony rite still faintly visible on the palm. "I know," he said. "I'm carrying it too." She looked at their hands, then at him. Something moved through her face that was not a named emotion he could categorize, something that existed below the named emotions, in the territory where relief and grief and the particular gratitude of someone who had been without something for so long that its presence felt like a new kind of pain all occupied the same space. "All right," she said. They left the stone reach as the morning fully opened above them, moving south and down toward Arkenspire, toward Casvin, toward an empire in the process of deciding what it was in the king's absence. The bond between them moved through the descent the way a compass moved. Not leading, not pulling, but present, directional. A constant orientation that had no interest in the difficulty of the terrain. Below them, the Ashfen foothills. Below that, the roads to the capital. Below that, The council chamber, where a 63-year-old man with 30 years of careful architecture was running out the clock on a window that was going to close the moment Valor Draven walked back through the door. The man who walked back through that door was not the same man who had walked out, and Casvin, who had built his 30 years of architecture on a thorough understanding of Valor Draven's nature, his command philosophy, his carefully maintained distance, his preference for calculation over everything that could not be calculated, Casvin did not yet know that the nature he had built his understanding on had changed. In the Ashvin foothills, one of Maritha Vane's retreating soldiers sent a signal ahead. The message reached Arkenspire in 6 hours. It said, "The anchor is gone. The bond is complete. They are coming back." Casvin read it in his council chamber, with the invalidation petition half-drafted on the table in front of him, and for the first time in 30 years, Lord Casvin of Vareth did not immediately know what to do next. He knew one thing. He had approximately 2 days, and the man coming back through the gates was not the man he had managed for 12 years. He began to write faster. In the hills above Arkenspire, moving at a pace that closed distance without announcing arrival, Valor Draven felt the bond steady and strong, felt the power resting in its channel, felt 12 years of careful walls beginning to reconfigure into something that was not walls but was not exposure either, something that had not had a name in his previous vocabulary, something he was going to have to learn the shape of as he went. He had done harder things. He was not certain of that, actually, but he had done things that had seemed impossible until they were done. The gates of Arkenspire appeared in the far distance, small with distance, the pennants visible but not readable. He looked at them and thought about what was waiting inside them, and what he was walking back into with nothing of his previous infrastructure intact, and one bond that was new enough to still be learning its own weight. And then Seraphina said quietly beside him, not asking, just observing, the way she observed everything, "You're calculating." "Yes." "Does it help?" He thought about that honestly. "It tells me what the problems are. It doesn't tell me what I'm going to do about them." "And what are the problems?" He looked at the gates. A council that has been operating inside someone else's construction for 30 years. An order with resources that don't disappear because one anchor failed. A petition that is going to be completed before we reach the capital. He paused. And a king who has to walk into a chamber full of men who knew him one way and introduce them to the version that exists now. She was quiet for a moment. "The version that exists now," she said carefully, "is more dangerous than the one they knew." "Yes. Not because of me. Not because of the power. No. Because you have something to lose," she said. "And men who have something to lose, who have decided the losing is not acceptable to... That's a different kind of threat than a man who is simply capable." He looked at her. The morning light was full now, and the stars in her eyes were quiet, and she was looking at him with the direct accuracy that she used for everything. No performance, no deflection, just the fact of her observation laid flat between them. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." She nodded, turned forward. They kept moving. Arkenspire's gates were 2 hours ahead. Casvin was inside them, writing. The council chamber was warm and the fire was going, and the petition was taking shape with the practiced precision of 30 years of document construction. And in the petition's margins, in handwriting much smaller than the main text, barely visible, Casvin had written 2 words that were not part of the official document. Words that he wrote and then crossed out and then wrote again, because they were the words beneath everything, the words that his 30 years of careful management had never found a satisfactory answer to. The words were, "What now?" The answer came through Arkenspire's outer gate, in the form of 2 figures on horseback, moving at the pace of people who had decided where they were going and were not interested in negotiation about it. The guards at the gate looked at the approaching riders. The guards looked at each other. And then the guard nearest the gate mechanism reached for the lever, because there were very few men who had served at Arkenspire's gate for more than 1 year, who did not recognize the way King Valor Draven sat a horse. And there was something in the way he was sitting it today that made the lever feel like the only correct response. The gate opened. Valor Draven rode through it without slowing. At his side, Empress Seraphina Veilheart, the name she would formally hold before the day was out, whatever the petition said, rode with the stars quiet in her eyes, and the bond steady in her chest, and 20 years of crystal towers behind her, and nothing, for the first time, above her. Inside the council chamber, the fire cracked. Casvin's pen stopped moving. He looked up from the petition document at nothing in particular, at the air of the room, at the specific quality of the silence that had just changed character in a way he recognized from 30 years of managing powerful men. The silence that arrived when power that had been absent re-entered a space. He looked at the door. The door opened. Valor walked in with no preamble, no announcement, no council protocol observed. Walked in the way he walked into field command posts after a night engagement, covered in the evidence of where he had been, wearing nothing that conceded anything, and he looked at Casvin and at the petition on the table and at the full council arrayed around it, and every man in that room made the same simultaneous internal calculation. This was not the meeting they had been preparing for. "My Lord King," Casvin began. "Don't," Valor said. The room went quiet. Serafina came through the door behind him, and the quiet got a different texture. The texture of a room full of men revising their understanding of what they were looking at. Not the noblewoman from the briefing documents, not the political signature at the bottom of a treaty. Something that had walked down from the Ashfin range with the evidence of what it had survived still on it, and stood in the council chamber's carefully maintained warmth, without adjusting to the room's expectations, without performing any version of itself that the room would find comfortable. Casvin looked at the anchor, or the absence of it, the news that had arrived 6 hours ago, the message he had been trying to build a strategy around. He looked at the petition. He looked at Valor. "The petition," Valor said, "is done. My Lord King, the council has the authority." "The council," Valor said, "has the authority I have delegated to it, which is not the same as the authority to legislate the safety of my wife in my absence, and is considerably less than the authority to conduct 30 years of managed information on behalf of an organization that has been working against this empire's interests from inside its own walls." The room was very still. Casvin's face did something complicated. The practiced neutrality held, but underneath it, the structure that held the neutrality was showing the same fracture lines it had shown in the camp. The fracture lines of a man whose conviction was genuine and whose methods had been chosen in service of that conviction, and who was now facing the evidence that the methods had failed. "You don't understand what she is," Casvin said, quietly, not performing for the room, saying what he actually believed. "What it will cost. When the awakening completes," Valor said, equally quiet, "she will not be alone, which is the only variable that has ever mattered, and which you spent 20 years ensuring could not exist." He held Casvin's eyes. "You knew that. You knew the historical record well enough to understand what isolation did to the Star Sovereign line. You arranged the isolation on purpose." Casvin was quiet. "Because a Star Sovereign with an anchor," Valor continued, "is not controllable, and the Order needs her to be controllable. And you genuinely believed, that control was the same as safety." He stopped. "Let that sit." "It isn't." The fire cracked. Outside the council chamber's windows, Arkenspire was going about its morning with the particular normalcy that large institutions maintained regardless of what was happening in their centers. People moving through corridors, guards making rounds, the ordinary infrastructure of a functioning palace continuing to function. Inside the chamber, 30 years of architecture was sitting on the table between them, and everyone in the room could see it, and nobody was yet certain what happened next. Casvin looked at the petition, at the document he had spent 6 hours building, at the 30 years of work that it represented. He looked at Valor. He looked at Serafina. Something in his face shifted. Not defeat. The specific, complicated rearrangement of a man who has held a position for so long that releasing it requires him to also release the version of himself that held it. "What do you intend?" he said. "To finish what was started," Valor said. "The border wars, the alliances, the empire I've been building on ground that turns out to be less stable than I understood." He paused. "The Order has resources. They will move again. The anchor is gone, but they are not. And the awakening is not complete. It is stabilized for now, but not complete." He looked around the room at the full council. Men he had known for years, men who had voted with Casvin, men whose loyalties were unclear, men whose loyalties were probably fine, and who had been managed the same way he had been managed. I need to know who in this room is in this room because they chose to be, and who is here because someone else's architecture put them here." A long silence. Then, from the far end of the table, a voice Valor had not expected. His youngest council member, a woman named Sarah Aldwin, who had been appointed 3 years ago and had no connection to Casvin's original circle, who had been quiet through the entire preceding exchange with the specific quality of quiet that belonged to someone who had been waiting to see which direction was real before they put their weight on it. "I'm here because I chose to be," Aldwin said, "and I'm reasonably confident that what I've been told about the situation has been reasonably inaccurate." A beat. "You're not wrong," Valor said. He looked at Casvin one final time. 30 years. The border wars, the long winters, and the longer campaigns, and the decisions made in the dark, on the basis of information that had been filtered by a man who believed control and protection were the same thing. "You're dismissed from the council," he said. "You are not arrested. You are not charged. Because you believed what you were doing was right. And because that belief was not performed, it was genuine. But you built something inside my walls that worked against what I was building, and that is finished." Casvin stood slowly. He looked at the petition on the table. He looked at the room. He picked up nothing on his way to the door. Left the petition, left the documents, left 30 years of careful architecture sitting on the table in the council chamber. At the door he stopped. "The order will not stop," he said. Not a threat, a fact. Delivered with the same flat accuracy that Serafina used for facts, and Valor wondered, briefly, what that meant about the kind of people who spent their lives in proximity to structures larger than themselves, and how proximity shaped the language they developed for truth. "I know," Valor said. Casvin left. The door closed. The council chamber held its breath. Serafina came to stand beside Valor at the table's head, and the bond between them had the solidity of something that had been tested in the last 48 hours more thoroughly than most bonds were tested in a lifetime. And it had held, and it was holding, and when she looked at the room full of men who were revising their understanding of what the Empire was, she did it with the stars quiet in her eyes and the full weight of what she carried balanced, not by force, but by choice. "We have work to do," Valor said to the room. Outside Arkenspire's walls, on the road south, Maritha Vane was riding hard, and the Order's next response was already forming, and the awakening that had been stabilized was not completed, and the ground beneath the Empire was still shifting. But the ground beneath Valor Draven was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where he had put it. It was not yet enough. It was a beginning, and in the borderlands to the north, in the place where the Order's deepest infrastructure lived, in the fortified complex that Casvin's information had never mentioned because Casvin had not known about it, because the Order's deepest assets were kept below the layer of any individual contact's knowledge. A door opened and a woman walked through it, and she was not Maritha Vane. She was older. She had no title anyone alive knew. She had been waiting in the specific patience of someone who had built her entire life around a single outcome, for the news that had just arrived. The news was that the anchor had failed. The news was that the bond was complete. She looked at the information for a long time. Then she said to the people waiting in the room, "Bring me the Varethian. He's had the king's trust for 30 years. That trust is gone now, which means he has nothing left to protect." The room moved, and the door closed again. And the last phase of something that had been in motion for a very long time began its final acceleration, aimed directly at the heart of what Valor Draven had just decided was worth protecting. Her name was Vane Soreth. That was all anyone knew, and that was all she had ever required anyone to know. She had operated inside the Order of the Void Crown for 40 years under various designations: advisor, archivist, senior strategist, names that changed the way the names of tools changed when the work they were used for changed. Underneath the designations, constant, a woman who had decided at 23 that the Star Sovereign bloodline represented the single greatest uncontrolled variable in the known world, and that her life's work was the elimination of that variable, not from malice, from the specific and absolute conviction that uncontrolled power was the mechanism behind every catastrophe the historical record contained, and that the responsible course of action was containment, and that containment justified whatever it required. She had been working toward this for 40 years. She was patient the way Stone was patient. She did not hurry. She did not panic. When Maritha Vane arrived at the Northern Complex and delivered the news about the anchor and the bond, Vane Soreth listened to all of it without expression, and when it was finished, she said 3 words. "Bring me Casvin." And then she waited. The news that reached Arkenspire in the small hours of the 3rd day after the council session came through the channel that Valor had spent those 3 days rebuilding. Not Casvin's channel, not the Order's managed conduit of information, but the raw channel of Sarah Aldwin's people, the intelligence network of a woman who had spent 3 years quietly building something Casvin had not noticed because Casvin had not taken her seriously. The news was, Casvin had been taken north. And the message accompanying that news, delivered in Casvin's handwriting on order paper, was addressed to Valor Draven personally and contained a location, a time, and 11 words. "She wants the final awakening. She is going to use me to get it." Valor read the message at the council table at 2 in the morning, with Aldwin across from him and 3 of his remaining trusted officers seated along the sides, and Seraphina standing at the window looking at the Arkenspire courtyard below, and the bond carrying the information from his hands to her awareness before he had finished reading, because that was how the bond worked now. Not invasive, not consuming, but present, the way breathing was present, the way the weight of your own body was present, continuous and non-negotiable, and gradually becoming the condition you could not remember being without. She turned from the window. "She wants to force the final awakening," Seraphina said. Not a question. "What she couldn't do with the anchor, she's going to attempt through leverage." He set the message down. "The bond is my anchor. If I'm threatened directly, if she applies enough pressure to the anchor, the power responds. Surges. She doesn't need the anchor device if she can trigger the surge manually. And a surging awakening in an uncontrolled environment is what she's been waiting 40 years for," Seraphina said. She turned fully from the window. The stars in her eyes were moving with the slow, cold steadiness they had when she was working through something rather than reacting to it. An awakening without structure, without the bond's containment, without the reach. The power expands outward. It doesn't discriminate. It's not a weapon I can aim. It becomes everything, in every direction. She paused. And she has a device, not the anchor, something older, that can capture an ambient dispersal, collect the power after it's released from the carrier. The room absorbed that. "After it's released from the carrier," Aldwin said carefully, "a star sovereign whose power completes an uncontrolled dispersal does not survive it." Seraphina's voice was even. "She never intended to leave me alive. The anchor was a clean method. What she's planning now is less clean, but the outcome is the same." A breath. "She's held Casvin because she knows Valor will come. She's designed the whole thing around the certainty that the anchor will try to protect the anchor." She was talking about herself in the 3rd person, which was what she did when the thing she was discussing was too large to hold in the 1st person. He had learned that about her in 3 days. He had been learning things about her at a rate that surprised him, not because the information was unexpected, but because the accumulation of it had a weight that increased with each addition, and the increasing weight was not a burden. It was the opposite of a burden. It was what it felt like when something empty filled. "She's right," Valor said. "About me coming." He looked at Seraphina across the room, which means the plan she's built around that certainty is only as good as her understanding of what I'm bringing. "She understands you," Seraphina said. "She's had Casvin for 3 days, 30 years of Casvin's observations. She knows your tactics, your command philosophy, your patterns under pressure. She knows who I was," he said, 3 days ago." He watched Seraphina understand what he meant, watched it move through her face, the recognition, and then the particular expression that he had come to understand as her version of something it took him a moment to name, because he was not practiced at the naming. It was the expression of being seen, of someone who had spent 20 years invisible looking at a person who was looking back. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking that the man Casvin spent 30 years observing would go north with his best remaining officers and attempt a tactical extraction. I'm thinking that's what Vane Soreth has planned for." He stood from the table. "I'm thinking that the version of me that exists now would do something different." "What?" He looked at her. "I'm thinking," he said, "that it's time to stop making the power a problem to be solved and start making it what it actually is. They rode north with 4 people, not an assault force, not a tactical extraction team built from his best remaining officers. 4 people: Veilor, Seraphina, Aldwin, whose value was not combat, but the specific intelligence about the Northern Complex's layout that she had spent 3 years quietly accumulating, and Dreth, whose value was the 12 years of demonstrated evidence that had made him the one person Veilor did not have to explain anything to. Aldwin had argued for more. Dreth had not argued for anything, because Dreth had understood immediately what the number meant, that this was not an operation built around force. The Northern Complex was 3 hours past the Ashfin Range's western edge, positioned in a natural basin that made conventional assault expensive and direct approach observable from a long distance. The Order had chosen well. It was the kind of position that rewarded patience in the holder and punished urgency in the attacker. Veilor did not approach it like an attacker. He rode in on the main road, openly, at a walking pace that announced exactly what it was: a man who had decided that the terms of the engagement were not the terms that had been offered. The arrogance of it, taken at face value, was almost total. 40 Order soldiers at the complex perimeter. The woman who had spent 40 years building toward this moment waiting inside. A captured man whose life was the lever she had designed the whole situation around. What it actually was something different from arrogance. There was a particular quality to the kind of courage that was not the absence of fear, but the decision that the fear's objections had been heard and outweighed. Veilor had operated from that quality for 12 years in the field, had applied it to terrain and troop counts and siege positions, and the 1,000 variations of situations where the numbers were wrong. He had never applied it to himself, to the interior version, to the walls he had built and the dependencies he had refused, and the very specific architecture of a man who had decided that what could not be taken was what he did not allow himself to have. He rode up the main road and understood that the interior application was the harder one, and that he had been doing it for 3 days without fully naming it, and that naming it now on this road was not weakness. It was the last wall coming down. The perimeter guards stopped them. He identified himself. The identification moved through the complex's communication structure and arrived, he assumed, at the room where Vane Soreth was waiting, and after approximately 4 minutes a response came back. They were to be brought inside. She had planned for this too. She had planned for him to come directly. What she had not planned for was the specific configuration of what he was bringing. Vane Soreth was smaller than he had expected, which was not a useful observation, but was the first one he had upon entering the complex's central chamber. She was seated at a table that was bare except for a single device. Not the anchor, something older, something that had the particular aesthetic of objects that had been built before anyone thought to make objects beautiful, purely functional, shaped entirely by its purpose. It was the collection device, what she had described to her people as the contingency. Casvin was in the room's corner, seated, not bound. She had not bound him, which told Veilor something about how she was using him, which was not as a prisoner, but as a demonstration. Look what I have. Look what I can do to what you trusted. The psychological application of the leverage rather than the physical. Casvin looked at Veilor when he entered, and his face did the thing it had done in the camp and then in the council chamber. The complicated rearrangement of a man confronting evidence that the version of reality he had built his life inside was not the only one. He had been in this room for 3 days, and 3 days with Vane Soreth was, Veilor suspected, an education in what the Order's actual convictions looked like when they were not being managed for outside consumption. Vane Soreth looked at Veilor, then at Seraphina, then at the bond between them, which was not visible but was present in the room the way temperature was present, not seen but felt, a quality of the air that changed how the air behaved. "You came directly," she said, not a greeting, an observation delivered with the tone of someone checking a prediction. "You designed the situation for me to come directly. I designed it for a man trying to save someone he'd made himself responsible for." She looked at him with the assessment of someone who had spent 40 years studying power and the people who held it. "I'm revising the assessment." "Revise it however you need to," Veilor said. "It won't change what's going to happen." "What do you believe is going to happen?" He did not answer that immediately. He looked at the collection device on the table. He looked at Casvin in the corner. He looked at Vane Soreth, at the 40 years of conviction in her face, at the specific kind of intelligence that had spent 4 decades in service of a single idea and had become, through that service, unable to fully conceive of the possibility that the idea was wrong. This was what absolute conviction did to a person. It did not make them villains. It made them architects of structures so thoroughly planned, so internally consistent, so long in the building, that the structure became indistinguishable from the truth. Vane Soreth did not believe she was wrong. She had never been given adequate reason to believe she was wrong, because the evidence she had collected across 40 years was genuinely accurate. Every unanchored star sovereign had been a catastrophe. Every awakening without containment had ended in destruction. Every historical instance supported her thesis. She had simply never encountered the instance that didn't, until now. "Serafina," Velor said. She moved to the center of the room. The stars in her eyes were fully bright. Not the desperate brightness of crisis, but the steady brightness of something that had found its expression and was choosing deliberately what to do with it. She stood in the center of the room and she looked at Vane Soreth, and she said the thing that Velor had spent the 3 days since the council session understanding she needed to say. "I know what you're afraid of," she said. Vane Soreth's expression did not change. "You've read everything ever written about the Star Sovereign line. I've read the same things. The destruction, the loss of self, the power consuming the carrier and then consuming everything the carrier touched." Serafina's voice was steady in the way it was steady now. Actually steady, the foundation steady rather than the surface. "You're not wrong that it happened, every time. You're not wrong that the power is enormous enough to unmake the things it encounters without discipline." A breath. "You're wrong about why it happened, and you're wrong about what prevents it." "I know what prevents it," Vane Soreth said. "Containment, extraction, ensuring the power exists in a form that can be managed rather than in a carrier who cannot be managed. What you're describing is not management. What you're describing is the same isolation that destroyed every carrier before me, imposed from outside rather than inside." Serafina's hands were at her sides. Loose. She was not performing calms. She was calm, which was an entirely different thing. "My father isolated me to protect me. The order before you isolated every star sovereign line they could find to protect the world. And every time, the isolation removed the anchor, and every time, without the anchor, the power consumed what was left." She held Vane Soreth's eyes. "You have been the mechanism of every catastrophe you were trying to prevent." The room was very quiet. This was the thing about truth that had the full weight of evidence behind it. It did not arrive loudly. It arrived in the specific silence of a sentence that could not be immediately refuted, settling into the air of a room and staying there, requiring response, waiting to see what the response would be. Vane Soreth was quiet for a long time. "Show me," she said finally. Not a concession, a demand. The demand of someone who had built 40 years on evidence and was still, despite everything, an empiricist. "Show me it's stable. Show me the awakening can complete without destruction." Velor looked at Serafina. She looked at him. The bond between them, in the specific quality of the room's attention, was the most present it had ever been. Not surging, not pressuring, not demanding anything it was not being given. Simply there. The weight of 2 people who had decided, separately and together, that the weight was worth carrying. "All right," she said. The final awakening, when it came, was nothing like what the histories had described. The histories described cataclysm. Stars falling, ground splitting, the carrier losing coherence, the self dissolving into the power expanding without limit until it had consumed everything it could reach. The histories were accurate about what happened when the carrier was alone. What happened when the carrier was not alone was different. The power unfolded. Not explosively, the same way it had unfolded at the creek crossing in the Ashfin foothills. The same slow unclenching of something that had been held for too long. But complete this time. Not stabilized at a partial point. All the way. The room went cold white. The crystalline light that the stone reach had reflected, present here without the stone to reflect it, coming from the bond itself, from the specific resonance of 2 people holding equal weight on either side of something enormous and refusing to drop it. Velor felt it move through him like water moved through a landscape, not destroying the landscape, not depositing itself in a pool and going still, but finding the natural channels, the existing paths, the places where it could flow without forcing. His wolf was fully present for the first time since the ceremony hall, not straining toward the connection but resting inside it, the way a wolf rested on ground it recognized as home. The power completed. Not in the way the histories describe completion, not in the erasure of the carrier, not in the dissolution of the self into the force. In the opposite way. Serafina Valhart was more fully present in the moment of the final awakening than she had been in any preceding moment, because what the awakening completed was not the replacement of herself with the power, but the integration of the power into a self that had, finally, been allowed to fully exist. The light faded. The room was intact. The table was intact. The collection device on the table had gone dark. Not destroyed, simply unnecessary. The same way the anchor had gone dark when the thing it was designed to extract refused to be separate from what held it. Casven, in the corner, was looking at the space where the light had been with an expression that Veilor had not seen on his face in 30 years of knowing him. Not calculation, not management. Something older and simpler than either, the expression of someone whose frame of reference has been permanently altered, and who is, for the first time, without a prepared response. Vain Soreth sat at her bare table and looked at Serafina, who was standing in the center of the room and was visibly herself, tired, present, the stars in her eyes fully blazing but steady, the steadiness of something that had found its permanent expression rather than its temporary containment. And the 40 years of Vain Soreth's face rearranged themselves, not into defeat, into something more complicated and more human than defeat. Into the expression of someone who has spent 40 years being right about a problem and has just discovered that the solution was something she had never been able to include in her model, because including it would have required her to believe it was possible, and believing it was possible would have required her to have seen it once. She was seeing it now. "The device," Veilor said. He nodded at the collection apparatus on the table. Vain Soreth looked at it. She reached out and pushed it toward the table's center, away from herself. A small gesture, freighted with everything that 40 years could make a gesture freight. "The Order," she said. "The rest of them. They won't accept this." "I know. 40 years of infrastructure. People who have built their lives around the same conviction I built mine around." She looked at the space where the light had been. "Showing them this won't be enough. They'll say it was managed, constructed, temporary. Then they'll need to see what comes after it," Serafina said. "Not one demonstration. What the power does when it's integrated. What I can do with it that the Order's model never accounted for, because the Order's model only ever planned for containment and destruction." She paused. "You spent 40 years preventing what you were afraid of. I'd like to spend 40 years doing something with what you were afraid of." Vain Soreth was quiet for a very long time. Then, "There are 12 senior Order commanders who will not be persuaded. They've been in this too long. They've committed too much." "Are they here?" Veilor said. "No. They're distributed. 4 are embedded in provincial administrations across the southern territories. 3 control significant portions of the trade routes. The remaining 5—" She stopped. "The remaining 5 are the ones who took your counselor's advice about the isolated camp location 3 years ago and built their own version of that principle. They're not findable unless they choose to be." "Findable or not," Veilor said, "they're operating inside my empire. They've been operating inside it for 30 years, on land that belongs to Vareth, using resources that were developed under Vareth's stability." He looked at her levelly. "The ones who can be persuaded, I will persuade. The ones who cannot, they will discover what the Empire's actual enforcement capacity looks like when it's not being managed by someone who has a reason to keep them comfortable." Vain Soreth looked at him, then at Serafina. "You trust her," she said, to Veilor. Not asking whether he did, asking him to account for it, to demonstrate that it was not performance. "Yes." "Why?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he had answered questions in the past 3 days. "Because she has given me more accurate information, more consistently, under worse conditions than anyone I have operated alongside in 12 years. He paused. "And because trust is not a feeling, it's a conclusion reached through accumulated evidence. I have the evidence." Vain Soreth absorbed that. She looked at her hands on the bare table, the hands of a 70-year-old woman who had spent every year of her adult life in service of a single conviction, and who was sitting in a room where the evidence had just fundamentally altered the shape of that conviction, and who was doing what empiricists did when the evidence was undeniable, updating. "What do you want from me?" she said. "Knowledge," Serafina said. "You have 40 years of study on the Star Sovereign bloodline. Every record the Order collected, every historical instance, every variation and anomaly." She held Vane Soreth's eyes. "I have the power and no map. You have the map and no power. Between us, we have something that neither of us has alone." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a very old idea, meeting a very new possibility, and finding the encounter more difficult and more necessary than either had prepared for. They left the complex with Casvin and without Vane Soreth, who remained, not as a prisoner, not as an ally yet, but as a woman with 40 years of knowledge who had agreed to sit with what she had seen before she decided what to do with it. Valor understood that. He gave her the time. The alternative was to treat her the way his old command philosophy would have treated her, as a secured asset, as a neutralized threat, as a variable to be managed. His old command philosophy had been built on ground that Casvin had helped design. He was building the new one on the actual ground, and the actual ground was that persuasion was slower than force and far more durable, and durable was what he needed the Empire to be. They rode south through the Ashfin foothills in the morning light, and Casvin rode with them, and no one spoke for the first hour, which was the hour that the silence needed. At the hour's end, Casvin said, "I owe you an account." "You owe me nothing," Valor said. "Debts are between people who are still in relationship. You were removed from the council. I owe you the account, regardless of whether the council relationship continues." Casvin's voice had lost the practiced level. What was underneath it was tired, old, and honest in the way that people became honest when the structure they had used to avoid honesty had been removed by circumstances. "I was recruited by the Order when I was 26, before your father's time. I still believe the kernel of it, that uncontrolled power is the source of uncountable human suffering. I have watched empires collapse. I have watched what happens when someone with the capacity to unmake things acts without constraint." He paused. "I also believed, until approximately 3 hours ago, that what I saw in that chamber was not possible." "What changed?" Serafina said. Casvin looked at her. He looked at the stars in her eyes. Steady, blazing, hers. "I spent my life studying what the power did to people. I never considered what would happen if a person was given the actual conditions to survive it." A long breath. "I was afraid of the power because every instance I knew ended the same way. I did not understand that I was looking at a controlled sample, that the controlling was what I was studying." "You were studying the effects of what you were doing," Serafina said. Not accusation, the flat accuracy she used for facts. The isolation, the extraction attempts. Every intervention the Order made to prevent an anchored awakening produced an unanchored one. You were generating your own evidence. Casvin closed his eyes briefly. "Yes. And you never had reason to question it because the evidence was always accurate. It always happened the way the model predicted." "Yes. The foothills were giving way to the lower terrain, the roads that led south toward Arkenspire and the council chamber, and the work that was waiting. Valor rode and felt the bond, and felt the mourning, and felt, underneath both of those, something that was not quite peace but was its functional neighbor. The specific quality of a situation that has passed through its worst and come out on the other side, and the things that remain are not simple but are workable, and workable was enough. What will you do?" he asked Casvin. Casvin was quiet for a moment. "I'm 63 years old. I have 30 years of administrative knowledge that is now separated from the position it was attached to." A dry sound that was not quite a laugh. "I have spent a great deal of time managing situations. I believe I have some remaining capacity to do that, if the situation is one I am not required to compromise to manage." "The Southern Territories," Valor said. 4 Order commanders embedded in provincial administrations. They know me as a military authority. They knew you as a council authority." He looked at Casvin sideways. "They do not know you as a man who sat in a chamber and watched 40 years of conviction update itself." Casvin looked at him, reading the offer. The specific cost of it, the exposure it required, the admission of what the update meant, The requirement to account for it to people who had shared the old conviction and who would find the update either threatening or liberating depending on what they had actually believed versus what they had been told to believe. That's a harder job than being on the council, Casvin said. Yes, Velor agreed. It is. Casvin thought about it the rest of the ride south. Up. They came back into Arkenspire through the main gate, which Velor had not done since the wedding night, had come and gone through the postern gate, the back channels, the exits that he had prepared and which had turned out to be compromised. He came through the main gate now because the main gate was the correct entrance for the return of a king who had been gone, and because the theater of power was not meaningless, it communicated something to everyone who saw it, and what he needed it to communicate was specific. The king was back. The king was not the same king who had left. The courtyard watched them come in, and what the courtyard saw was Velor Draven on his gray horse with his field coat and his 3-day-old shoulder bandage, and nothing about his appearance conceding anything to the situation. And beside him, Seraphina Veilheart, with the stars fully blazing in her eyes in the morning light, not concealed, not managed, not pressed into invisible containment, simply present the way she was present, which was completely. Aldwin was at the council chamber steps when they came through. Casvin's network, she said, by way of greeting, before they had fully dismounted. The ones that are still responding to his old channels. I have names and positions. Casvin, Velor said, looking at the older man. Casvin looked at the list Aldwin held. He looked at the names, people he knew, people he had worked alongside, people whose convictions he had shared and whose architecture he had been part of. He took the list. Give me 2 weeks, he said. Velor nodded. Casvin walked into the palace. The council session that afternoon was not the session anyone in the room had been expecting, which was by design. Velor did not address the petition. He did not address the events of the preceding week through the formal language of council proceedings, did not submit them to the procedural structure that would have allowed the chamber to process them at the pace of documentation rather than the pace of reality. He sat at the head of the table and he described plainly what had happened. Not the political version, the actual version, the camp, the reach, the bond, the final awakening, the northern complex, the collection device that was now sitting in Arkenspire's vault because Vayne Soreth had not stopped them from taking it. He described Casvin's 30 years and the Order's architecture and the managed information and what it had cost and what it had produced, and he did it without performance of anger, because anger would have been inaccurate. What he felt about Casvin was not anger, which was the emotion for wrongs done by enemies, but something more complicated. The emotion for wrongs done by people who genuinely believed they were doing right, which did not have a clean name, but was heavier than anger and required more to carry. And then Seraphina spoke. She had not been to a council session before. She had not been to anything that looked like a deliberative body before. The towers had not included debate. She stood at the table and she spoke with the flat accuracy that was her natural register and the steadiness that was her post-awakening condition, and she described what the power could do in integrated form, not as a threat and not as a promise, as information. She described the border regions where the soil had failed for 6 consecutive seasons and the crops were not coming back. She described the rivers that had shifted course during the Second Border War and left 3 provinces without their primary water sources. She described the things that she could see now, not metaphorically, not as a figure of power, but literally. The capacity that the integrated power had given her to perceive the physical conditions of the land in ways that ordinary human perception could not, and the things that those conditions suggested could be addressed. The council was quiet, in the specific way of people hearing something that is simultaneously outside their frame of reference and directly relevant to problems they have been unable to solve. Aldwin said, "At the end, the Western Province water issue. You could actually address that." "Yes," Seraphina said. "The soil failure in the border regions. That will take longer. The conditions are deeper. But yes." Aldwin looked at Velor. He looked back. The communication between them was the communication of people who had spent 3 days in the specific intimacy of crisis and had developed, through it, the shorthand that usually took years. "The petition," Aldwin said. Velor looked at it on the table. The document that Casvin had been building before he was dismissed, that had been left half-finished, and had remained on the table because no one had been certain what to do with an unfinished petition from a dismissed counselor regarding events that had subsequently revised themselves entirely. He picked it up. He looked at it for a moment. He set it in the hearth fire at the chamber's side wall. It caught immediately. The parchment was good quality, expensive, the kind Casvin had always preferred for formal documents. It burned cleanly. Nobody in the room said anything. Detect. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing that came after was simple, and Valor had stopped expecting simplicity as a condition of anything that mattered. The 12 senior order commanders who could not be persuaded were, over the course of those months, found. Most of them were found because the Empire's actual enforcement capacity, unmanaged and unfiltered, was significantly more effective than it had been when Casvin was shaping the information it operated on. 3 of them were found because Vane Soreth, who spent 2 weeks sitting with what she had seen and then made a decision that was visible in her face when she arrived at Arkenspire. The decision of a woman who has updated a 40-year belief and is carrying the weight of that update without asking anyone to help her with it, provided information that the Empire's network could not have developed on its own. She and Seraphina met twice a week in the palace library. The meetings were not comfortable. They were honest, which was the more important quality. Vane Soreth's 40 years of records were genuine scholarship produced from genuine concern, and the scholarship was accurate about what it had observed. What it had not observed, what it had no mechanism to observe, was the variable it had spent 40 years preventing. Seraphina read it all. She read it with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 20 years in a tower memorizing everything she was given, and she brought the same quality to material produced by the woman who had been the primary architect of the system that had held her captive, not as a prisoner, but as a managed variable. She read it, and she took what was useful, and she added to it the information that only the carrier of the power could add, and what they built together was something that neither could have built alone, which was the principle, which was, Valor understood, watching them across the library table on a gray winter afternoon 3 months after the Northern Complex, which was what all of it had been about, from the moment the blood had mingled on the altar of Arkenspire and the stars had come down into the hall. Not the power, not the order, not the Empire's borders or the border wars or the treaty that had been nothing more than a beginning misunderstood by everyone who arranged it, of something none of them had the frame of reference to correctly anticipate. The principle was that the things that destroyed were the things that were alone, not metaphorically, structurally. The power that consumed its carrier consumed it because the carrier had no one to carry the weight with. The empire that failed because its king had managed himself into a position where every dependency was a vulnerability and the only safe condition was isolation. The order that spent 40 years generating the catastrophes it was trying to prevent generated them through the same mechanism, the belief that control was safer than contact, that management was safer than trust, that the risk of connection was greater than the certainty of what happened without it. All of them had been practicing the same mistake, some from fear, some from conviction, some from the simple accumulated habit of a man who had spent 12 years making survival the first requirement and had confused survival with living. He sat in the library doorway and watched Seraphina and Vane Soreth argue about a 600-year-old text, arguing with the specific intensity of two people who both care enough about accuracy to not concede a point they believe is wrong. And he thought about the version of himself that had stood at the altar of Arkenspire 3 months ago and had been irritated by the smell of candle wax. That man had been complete in the ways that survival required and empty in everything else. He did not miss him. He was learning, daily, what filled the space the emptiness had occupied. He was learning it the way he had learned everything that mattered, through the accumulated evidence of practice, through the experience of holding weight and discovering that the holding was possible, through the specific education that came from being wrong in ways that were survivable and then surviving them. Seraphina looked up from the argument and found him in the doorway. She had a look she used for him. He had noticed it approximately 2 weeks in and had been aware of it every time since. That was not soft exactly and was not hard. That existed in the register between those things, in the register of someone who had spent 20 years having no one to look at with that quality, and who was, therefore, very deliberate about the looking. He looked back. This was the discipline he had not known he was practicing, Not the walls, not the partition, not the managed distance. This, the capacity to be looked at by something that mattered and to look back at it without calculating what it cost. It cost everything. It was worth everything. These were not contradictory statements. The celestial throne was not built overnight. It was built the way things that hold are built, slowly, through the accumulation of evidence that the foundation is real, through the testing of weight against structure, through the discovery of which walls were necessary and which were merely the architecture of someone who had not yet learned what they were actually building. It was built through the Western provinces getting their water back, which was not dramatic, but was the kind of thing that made an abstract concept, power used for something other than its own continuation, concrete and observable and undeniable to the people who had been thirsty. It was built through Casvin returning from the southern territories, 2 weeks becoming 6 weeks, becoming 3 months, and the order commanders who had been embedded in provincial administrations discovering that the man who came to talk to them was not the man who had sent them there, was a man who had sat in a room with the thing he had spent 30 years managing and had come out the other side of it different, and who was not interested in the performance of convincing them, but only in giving them the same accurate information that had changed his own assessment and then letting them decide. Some of them decided one way. Some of them decided another. The ones who decided against it were found and removed from the positions they had used the empire's stability to occupy while working to undermine it. The ones who decided with it were, in the cautious and evidence-based way that Vialor applied to everything, given time to demonstrate that the decision was real. It was built through Vane Soreth's knowledge and Seraphina's power producing over 2 years of careful work, a document that had never existed before, an accurate account of the Star Sovereign bloodline that included the variable that every previous account had been designed to eliminate: what the power was, what it needed, what it could do when the carrier was given the actual conditions to survive it. It was built through Dreth, who received a formal commission that he accepted with the expression of a man who had expected it and had prepared nothing for it because preparation would have conceded that he had been waiting for it, which he considered beneath his dignity. It was built, most fundamentally, through the accumulation of mornings, the kind that did not announce themselves, the kind that were snow-covered in winter and warm in summer and gray in the months between, mornings in the palace gardens when there was time, and mornings in the council chamber when there was not, mornings on the road between provinces when the work required it, and mornings in the palace library arguing about 600-year-old texts because the texts were wrong about one specific thing and the wrongness mattered. Mornings that were not simple and were not easy and were not the mornings of people who had solved the fundamental difficulty of being human. They were the mornings of people who had decided that the difficulty was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be inhabited, and that inhabiting it with someone was different from inhabiting it alone. Vialor Draven had spent 12 years understanding survival. He spent the years after understanding something his 12 years of survival had not given him vocabulary for: what you did with survival once you had it, what it was for, what justified the cost of all the years it had taken to build it. He understood it, eventually, as the thing Seraphina had said in the Ashfen foothills, in the cold morning light, with the wrong stars gone and the right ones not yet visible. The stars don't ask permission, they simply burn, and the darkness has no choice but to make room. This was not a comfort exactly. It was not a resolution of the difficulty or an erasure of the cost. It was something more useful than comfort. It was accurate. It was the description of what happened when something that was genuinely itself refused, finally, to be contained. The Empire did not become perfect. It became real, which was harder and more durable and worth considerably more than perfect, because perfect required a controlled environment and real survived everything else. The order did not disappear. It changed slowly, the way things changed when the evidence that built them was revised, and the people who held the revised evidence chose, one at a time, to let the revision matter. Some never chose that. Those did not disappear either. They simply found that the world they had built their opposition inside had shifted in ways that made the opposition increasingly expensive and increasingly unnecessary. And eventually the force of that shifted the world accordingly. Vane Soreth died in the 4th year, in the library, with the document half finished and Seraphina across the table. She died arguing. She died in the specific satisfaction of someone who has spent their life in service of an idea and has seen, at the end of it, that the idea was not wrong. only incomplete. That she had spent 40 years studying the right problem. That the solution was not the one she had built, but that someone who had access to everything she had built had used it to find the actual one. Serafina finished the document alone. It took 2 more years. She wrote Vane Soreth's name on the cover alongside her own. Violor read it when it was finished. He read all 600 pages, which was the longest single document he had ever read, and which was, in places, technical beyond his ability to fully follow, and which was also, in those same places, the most accurate description of what it was to carry something enormous and survive the carrying that he had ever encountered in any form. He set it down when he was done. He looked at Serafina. She was watching him with the specific look, the one that was not soft and was not hard, that lived between those things. "Well," she said. "It's accurate," he said. "Yes. The part about the carrier surviving, it's accurate." She was quiet for a moment. The stars in her eyes moved slowly, the permanent settled brightness of the integrated power, no longer something separate from her that she carried, but something that was simply part of what she was. "I'm glad you think so. You're in it." "I know. The anchor sections, I wrote them from what I actually observed." "I know," he said again. And then, because the version of him that existed now was a version that had learned, through specific and daily practice, to say the things that the previous version would have stored in the partition and never addressed. "It's the most honest thing I have ever read." She looked at him for a long moment. "We're not finished," she said. "Not the crises. Those were handled or manageable, or the kind that were simply the ongoing condition of living in a world that was not simple." She meant the work of being what they were. "There will be more. The power still has limits I don't fully understand. The Empire has debts from 12 years of border wars that peace alone won't resolve. The 12 commanders, 9 now. 9 commanders still out there. Yes. It's not resolved." "No," he agreed, "it's not resolved. It's ongoing, which is different from unresolvable." He held her eyes. "Ongoing means we keep working. Unresolvable means we stop. I don't intend to stop." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "Neither do I." Outside the library windows, Arkenspire's courtyard moved through the ordinary business of a functioning palace and a functioning empire. Guards making rounds, people crossing the stone in all directions. The particular normalcy of a place that had come through catastrophe and settled into the harder, quieter work of everything that came after. Inside the library, 2 people who had found each other under the worst possible circumstances and had decided, separately and together, and repeatedly, that the finding was worth the conditions it came with, sat with the evidence of what they had built and the knowledge of what remained to build. The crown was not the heaviest thing either of them had carried. The crown was the easy part. The hard part was the same hard part it had always been. Not power, not enemies, not the Order's 40-year architecture or the Empire's 12-year debt, or the 9 commanders still operating in the Empire's borders, or the awakening that was complete but ongoing, always ongoing, the power that was integrated but alive and continuing to be lived. The hard part was the ordinary, daily, uncelebrated decision to remain, not to survive. Survival was the beginning, the requirement, the minimum. To remain, to choose, past the crisis and the catastrophe and the point of no return and the final awakening and all the dramatic irreversibility of everything that had dragged both of them through the worst months of their lives. To remain present in the thing they had built together, not because it was easy and not because it was finished, but because it was theirs. That was the hard part. Valor Draven had never done anything hard that he had not eventually done well. He intended to continue the pattern. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear. The right stars, in the right sky, in the right positions. The ordinary night sky of a world that had kept its shape, that had not been consumed or remade or erased, that had survived the moment when the power was complete and the carrier was not alone, and had come out the other side with its fundamental structure intact. The stars burned. The darkness had made room. And in the library of Arkenspire, the king and the empress sat together in the ongoing difficulty of what they had chosen, and it was not enough. And it was everything, and they were not finished. They were not finished.